Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rachel Rees tōku ingoa, ko Roti Koromato whakatū. Nō mā haere mai. Welcome to this deliberations meeting for the future development strategy for Nelson and Tasman. I'll invite Deputy Mayor Iga to open with karakia.
Kia ora. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki wahu, tuia te hera tangata, ka ronga te pou, ka ronga te ao, humi e, hui e, tā ki e.
Kia ora, welcome to everybody. We've got a full chamber at Tasman and we've got other members of the panel, Aina tēnā koe, joining us on Zoom and staff supporting our process today. So what I'm going to do to start is we're going to do a round of introductions so that we can have a record of who is present and in attendance. So I've introduced myself, Rachel Rees, the Mayor of Whakatū.
Stuart Bryant, the Deputy Chair of this committee, and Deputy Mayor Tasman, Chair of Operations Committee and Lakes Murchison Ward Councillor.
Kia ora, Kip Mailing, Richmond Ward Councillor, Tasman District, Chair of the Policy and Strategy Committee.
Good morning, David Ogilvie, Tasman District Council, Moderator Ward, Deputy Chair of the Regulatory Committee.
Tēnā koutou ko Brian McGirt, taka ingoa, ko hene hea whakatū aho. Brian McGirt, Nelson City Councillor, Chair of the Infrastructure Committee.
Morning, Maya Bengozi, Policy Planner at Tasman District Council.
Good morning, everybody. Cameron Wallace, Senior Associate at Barker & Associates, assisting the council team in the preparation of the FDS.
Good morning, Rachel Morgan, Consultant Planner at Barker & Associates, supporting the council team.
Morning, everyone. I'm Chris Forson from Nelson City Council, Project Lead on the Future Development Strategy from Nelson side.
Tēnā koutou, Jackie Deans, Growth Coordinator from Tasman District Council.
Kia ora koutou, Barry Johnston, I'm the Environmental Policy Manager at Tasman District Council.
Morena, ko Claire Barton, tōku ingoa, and I'm the Group Manager Environmental Management at Nelson City Council.
Morena, ko Judine Edgar Aho, Koromatua Tuaroa, Deputy Mayor, Nelson City Council and Chair of Urban Development.
I'm Gabby Drummond from Tasman District Council and I'm controlling the tech today.
Morena, I'm Robin Shearer. I'm Executive Assistant to the Mayor of Tasman District Council and I'm also taking minutes today. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Susan Edwards. I'm the Group Manager Service and Strategy at Tasman District Council.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'll now move to the Zoom screen. And tēnā koe, Aina.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Aina Kumirokara France, tōku ingoa, iwi representative Te Tauihu. Kia ora.
And then if I can just move to any consultants or staff who are here in attendance for the meeting. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Curtin, you can start off and then I'll let the other people follow afterwards.
Kia ora, ko Curtin tōku ingoa. I work at a company, Sense Partners, that has helped provide advice to both Tasman and Nelson councils on the FDS.
Kia ora, Mirka.
Good morning, I'm Mirka. I'm the team leader for land use and soil. I'll just be listening in case there's any questions that pop up that I might be able to answer.
Thank you. And do we have any other staff or consultants on Zoom? No, I don't think we have. I think that covers everybody. So welcome. Welcome to all of you. We're on day one of potentially 3 days of deliberations process. We will be meeting today, tomorrow and I expect Thursday, and we'll see how we get on for these first couple of days. Are there any apologies that I need to be aware of? Kia ora, Aina.
Kia ora. Just an apology that I may have to leave probably around about 10:30 today to meet the kaumata and Mapua. I've actually corresponded with you via email. I think we'll just keep this matter in confidence if that's okay with you, Madam Mayor.
That's absolutely fine, Ina, and thank you. We'll note and accept your apology. Would you like that to be resolved, Susan, or would you, and Robin, or would you like us just to note that? We're just going to note that.
Yeah. Furthermore, I've arranged to fly back to Auckland tonight. So I don't want to get trapped here. I haven't improved since Friday. And so I'll be online from Auckland instead of online from this hotel room here in Nelson. How do you feel about that, Madam Mayor?
I know I'm very, very comfortable with that, and whatever we can do to support you, we will. So I really appreciate you being available for the hearing, but if you feel that that's not going to be possible, then you can just let us know if you feel that's not going to be possible tomorrow or later today.
Oh, thank you. I can attend online. The reason why I'm not there, I don't know what I have. I've actually conducted 2 RATS tests and I'm negative. But I don't want to, yes, and that's why I'm not there in person. And after my blessing, after what happens today with the hapu, I'll find out from that point in terms of how I feel. But for my own safety, I don't want to be trapped in a hotel and my health diminishes, and nor do I want to make everyone else sick and they're present in the deliberations. So kia ora.
We absolutely understand. Absolutely. Any other apologies I need to be aware of? I need to step out today briefly. I've got I'll need to be out of the meeting from about 1:30. Oh no, not today actually. Apologies, I'll be here right through today, but tomorrow I will have to step out for a short period, but I'll advise you of that tomorrow. All right.
A quick question, what time are we here tomorrow, Madam Chair?
Tomorrow, we are starting tomorrow at 11 a.m. and we will be finishing at 4 p.m. Unless I can't change an appointment that I need to be at, another regional meeting. So I'll need to head away to a meeting, but if the panel felt that they could continue without me, then you can make that call tomorrow if you want to go a bit later.
And the time on Thursday?
And on Thursday, my diary is showing from 9 until 4:30.
Today.
And today, my diary is showing 9 till 12:30. Thank you. All right, so we've all got the same thing. That's great. Excellent. All right. No other questions before we get underway? I'll hand now across to Susan Edwards, who is going to introduce the role of the Future Development Strategy and Subcommittee. Kia ora, Susan. And just in terms of receiving the report, you can give me some advice as to when you'd like us to do that. I can do it at the beginning, or we can do it a bit later in the process. Thank you.
Kia ora. Good morning, everybody. There's a couple of things I need to talk about first. One relates to the fact we are likely to have a fire alarm test in the near future. So just advising you that you don't need to panic. It's just a test. They're just installing some things and then we will know, we will get a test after that. So don't be too surprised if you get a bit of a fright when the alarm goes off, but you don't need to pack up and leave. So that's the first thing. The second thing I just wanted to note was that when the agenda went out, it should have also had Chris Pawson's name as one of the report authors on the top. Unfortunately, we didn't do that manual adjustment once it was drawn through from Info Council, so I apologise for that. That was certainly a joint effort by both Jackie and Chris. So now I'd just like to talk a little bit about the process that we've been running through in terms of the future development strategy. As you're all aware, we consulted on a draft future development strategy. We put out a statement of proposal that had a summary of information and included a copy of the draft FDS for the community to consult on. The subcommittee received about, I think it was 568 submissions on the consultation document we put out. In that, there was a variety of views expressed on a range of different matters. Sometimes there were views on both sides of an issue expressed, so we didn't necessarily just get a single viewpoint from the community. So the committee has a role, and the subcommittee has a role in terms of considering those community views, but it also needs to consider the advice it receives from officers, other advice it's received from consultants and various other parties, plus it needs to consider its legal obligations in terms of what it's required to do under the Resource Management Act and the Local Government Act. Once the subcommittee has made formed its views, then it will make some recommendations through to the joint committee of both councils. The intent is that the joint committee will make the policy decisions on the 27th of July as to what would go in the final future development strategy, and then the final future development strategy will be signed off during August. There are two options to that can either be done by the joint committee, or if the joint committee is happy to, it could delegate that decision back to the subcommittee to do. So during this process we're undertaking at the moment, it's on the deliberations and submissions. The committee needs to consider if it has sufficient views from the community and a good understanding of their views and preferences before making changes to what was in the draft. So that would be any additional sites to be added, any sites that need to be amended, or any sites that are to be removed from the future development strategy. And you'll see in the officer's report that there are recommendations along all three of those lines: some new sites to be added in, some sites to be removed, and some sites to be amended. So the subcommittee needs to consider if it has sufficient information on the views and preferences of people who may be affected or interested in those changes. The other thing to remember is that the submissions are one input into the submission process, the deliberations process. The subcommittee has a wider understanding of matters that the public isn't necessarily always privy to, and you receive a wider range of advice. The final future development strategy may be different to that consulted on, provided that it is within the scope of the consultation that you've undertaken. So if there's any questions around process, and that could be now or it could be as we're going through, staff are happy to help clarify that for you. Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much for those introductory comments. And I just want to acknowledge, before we get into the questions and answers and working our way through, the amount of work that's gone into preparing this future development strategy. I know the teams have been working solidly now for several months, and just want to acknowledge the report that we've received today and all of the documents that sit behind this process. Thank you very much for your work. It's a complex issue to bring together, and we're going to work our way through the issues over the next few days to get to our decision-making points. So we'll probably use an approach that I have used previously, that is, if we get to decision points, we'll do those in principle. And then when we come to the end, we'll then do a wrap up, and then we'll go do a consolidation resolutions to capture everything. Just in case as we go through, we make a change somewhere else that we need to then come back and reflect on a prior decision. Hopefully the committee's comfortable with that approach. And so that's the way that we'll run through it, which is a similar way that I do the long-term plan deliberations processes. So we just build it up, and once we've got it all together, we'll do the final resolution as we go through, sweeping one. There may be a couple of other changes to what came out in the document in relation to resolutions that we'll need to work through, but I think we can capture them a bit later in the hearings process. They're just procedural matters that we'll need to cover off. So opening now for questions. Councillor McGurk.
Thanks, Madam Chair and through you. First, acknowledge the the work of the officers who have brought this to us, and also to the public for submissions. Probably a very brief question is just to Ms. Edwards there in terms of advice about weighting that when we have conflicting views or differing views, what weight should we apply to those sorts of views?
Through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, it's always an interesting one because sometimes you get a lot of submissions that sort of make comments on a particular issue, and then you might get some other submissions that make different comments on an issue. So really it's a matter of weighing up the content of those and the analysis that goes in those submissions. Some of the submissions have a lot of content in them and are very well, well worked through and well analysed and provide a lot of supporting information. Where there's a lot more information and a lot of background and support, you can often end up giving more weight to something that's just in some cases, a pro forma submission that would suggest that you just sign something off. So it's around considering the content, the analysis, the strength of the submission, rather than necessarily the numbers. It's not a numbers game. It's not a vote. So it's about the strength of the argument that's put before you, really. And in terms of when you get good arguments put on both sides, which is the case in some of the material that we've received, it's then around looking at it in the context of your legal obligations, what it is that you're trying to achieve for the community, and the outcomes, and trying to see which approach is most likely to lead to the outcomes that you're seeking for the community. So it's not a black and white situation, so it's a little bit difficult to answer, but hopefully that's helped a little.
Any further questions from the panel members? No, we're all set to go. All right, I think the best thing to do is that we receive the report in the first instance. So that is the first recommendation that we have in our suite of recommendations that we received, the deliberations hearing Nelson Tasman Future Development Strategy report. I won't read out the number, but it's clear that's resolution recommendation 1. So does someone care to move? Thank you, Deputy Chair. Seconded by Councillor McGurk. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. That is carried. Thank you. All right, now we've received the report. I will hand over to the officers to introduce the different sections. But before I do that, I'll go to Deputy Mayor Edgar.
Madam Mayor, just in relation to number 1, I just wondered if the second resolution was also a good one to consider at this stage, because I think that's sort of important to note that up front, that we have received all the written, verbal and late submissions.
Let's do that as well.
Supporting information, so I'm happy to move.
You're happy to move? Thank you. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mayling. So we're doing recommendation 2, which relates to the receiving all the written, verbal and late submissions. I'm not aware of any more material that we need to consider. In fact, I'm just going to have to take a little brief moment just to confer with Ms. Edwards on a matter, and I'll come back to you. I just want to be absolutely clear on that in terms of what we can consider. Right, thank you for that moment. I just wanted to confer with Ms Edwards just to make sure that we are we've got everything that we need in terms of the submissions that have been sent through into the process, and we're comfortable that we do. So that has been moved and seconded. I'll now put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against? That's carried. Thank you. Right, Jackie and Chris, welcome. We'll hand over to you. We've got a bit of a program that that you've set out for us to run through the different topics, and that looks reasonable to me. If all the members of the panel got a copy of this program, just setting out the different topics, and I'll just check, and that's been emailed through to Ina as well. She'll have a copy of that one. Yes, thank you. Okay, thanks, Ina. All right, we'll get underway then. Jackie and Chris.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So yes, as you can see, in the officer's report, we have about 14 different themes that we've gone through. We've introduced the context in terms of submissions. We've provided some analysis, and we've made some recommendations, options and recommendations for each theme. So what we're proposing is we go through each of those themes during the deliberations, and we have proposed an order there, which is slightly skewed according to people's availability as well in terms of the consultants being here today. So we thought we'd try and get through, if we can, the three issues, the sort of quite complex issues that involve Barkers and sentence partners as well today. So we've got suggesting that we have housing land capacity and uptake rate first, then we do the greenfield, brownfield housing capacity split, and then we do the growth projections. So if you're happy for that, then we'll go from there.
That's fine. I think that's fine. Panel's happy with that. Thank you.
All right. The capacity and uptake rate topic is mine. So during the submissions, we had two main issues that were raised, and it was that the uptake rate that we used was too slow and far too conservative to allow intensification to be prioritised over greenfield. And then the other was that FDS was relying on, if you like, piecemeal intensification as sites came up, individual sites, rather than comprehensive redevelopment of larger areas. And the overall effect that submitters were concerned about was that we'd see less intensification than we potentially could if we had assumed a higher rate, and as a result we were using too much greenfield land. So from an officer's perspective, it's pretty clear that the uptake rate in itself is a pretty complex thing to determine, and in fact it's something that there has to be, there is a lot of uncertainty around. And where we settled was the 15% uptake rate, so that's 15% of feasible sites over a 30-year period, not 15% of all sites, just to be clear on that, as there were a few submissions that that seemed on the face of it to think that was how we were calculating it. Okay. To give us some more, if you like, comfort around that rate, we engaged Curtin Lees to provide a little more commentary, if you like, on that and some further assessment. And he's actually available here on with us on Zoom. And I was wondering if you're happy, it'd be good to have his just some further comment from him, if that's okay with you, Madam Mayor.
Yes, Curtin, it'll be helpful if you can talk us through your rationale for the uptake rate. I think that will be useful.
Sure, thank you. So like Chris suggests, the uptake rate is not simple or easy to come up with what the appropriate rate should be. What I did is use some existing work I had done at the end of last year on the medium density residential standards, cost benefit analysis that was well received, that looked and has uptake rates for a number of urban areas. Now that's important because kind of the environment for thinking about uptake rates has changed, and here was an existing piece of work that we could kind of look to and use without doing a very long piece of analysis that might otherwise be required. So when I look at those kind of uptake rates for other sort of urban areas, thinking about Christchurch, thinking about Wellington, thinking about Hamilton, 15% seems like a reasonable number when we look at the types of land values to the types of capital values across those other cities. So I suggested 15% looks like a reasonable number based on that piece of analysis. But we can also look to some other pieces of work that can help substantiate that kind of a number. So one particular piece of work that was interesting in that regard is a piece of work that Becca did with regard to inner suburbs within the Wellington region. Now that work actually predates that MDRS policy that came through towards the end of last year. And that work kind of looked at, not sort of your Johnsonville or further out than that, but sort of Kandala, Naya, sort of inner city suburbs, and then thought through what are the kind of reasonable uptake rates for different types of development that we might see going forward. So when we kind of look at that, Becca's kind of approach was to think about a number of stages for doing that work before they kind of get to an uptake rate, thinking about the types of density that you observe in each kind of suburb. What that work suggested that for sort of category 3 and category 4 type areas, where you're looking at up to 4 stories and up to 6 stories for your category 4, that you might expect uptake rates of around 14%. Now, these are kind of your higher density areas. We're not talking about up to 3 stories here, but they use 14% as a benchmark for that study. So that kind of seems in line with the type of that 15% that we had previously come up with. And that was before I kind of looked at that piece of work to use a 15% number. So that seems to square the use of an uptake rate of 15%. So then we can also kind of look at what are the types of outcomes that you might get from using an uptake rate for 15%. And we look at those kind of uptake, applying that type of uptake rate through the Becca study. And it seems as though you're kind of getting development type numbers that sort of seem in line with what we might see through the FDS. So that was the process to get to that 15% uptake rate. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Curtin. Any questions for Curtin? Councillor Ika.
Thank you. Curtin, my question probably slightly cuts across uptake rate and also greenfield, brownfield housing capacity split. But I noted in the staff report, a lot of the discussion seems to, and I think I noted it in your report as well, sorry if I'm misrepresenting it though, is that, there's this reference to greenfield sort of and intensification as 2 totally separate development models. And doesn't greenfield or couldn't, shouldn't greenfield development have intensification in it? Because, hopefully we're not wanting to perpetuate, standalone houses. And so does the intensification uptake rate consider that we would be supporting or encouraging through plan changes, etc., greater intensification either through heights or smaller section sizes, intensification of greenfield sites?
So the uptake rate's not really trying to say what should be. It's trying to think objectively about what might happen. And like sort of Chris alluded to with kind of the uncertainty here, is we've had quite a large change in terms of the MDRS that went through at the end of last year. And this is trying to come up with an uptake rate that speaks to that kind of large policy change. So it's about what we think the development community might sort of take up. It's not really coming up with this is the right uptake rate because it brings about a particular policy objective or an objective for the ratio of greenfields to brownfields land.
I guess if I can just ask a follow-up question.
I might just go to Chris first, because I think he wants to add something to that answer.
Yes, can I just, through the chair, I'd just like to add that when we're talking about intensification versus greenfields, the intensification we're treating very much as the intensification of the existing built urban area, if you like. So we're talking redevelopment of a site by demolishing a building and putting more dwellings on that site, so building a new building on there, or backyard infill behind an existing building. Greenfield has been treated entirely differently, and then some assumptions around the densities within that, the likely the development density, if you like. So the 15% is only being applied to the intensification of the existing built urban area, just to be clear on that.
Thank you very much for that. So that probably removes a number of my questions. So very helpful. Thank you, Chris. I guess just in relation to that though, and just thinking back on the draft that we put out, was that really clear? Because I guess to me, like if I look at the language in the report, that, you know, absolute gem of a clarifying comment, I never found that within the report we've got, and I don't recall, but happy to be corrected as to whether it was, you know, we've made it really clear that intensification, what that exactly means, versus greenfield already has greater density, you know, different heights built within the model. I guess just the way we always talk about versus, they sound very separate.
I'll go to the authors and see if they can identify some sections of the material that would speak to that issue, that we're of the different typologies that we would have in greenfield.
We might just need a couple of moments just to...
We'll come back to that one then.
Yeah,
and we'll, did you have any further questions, Councillor Rika? And then I'll go to Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, just one more, which was in relation to this theme. And on page 139 of the attachments, there were two recommendations from B&A, Barker and Associates, I think that is. And they don't seem to be reflected through into the staff recommendations. And so I was just wondering if we could get some comment on that.
Can you identify the two recommendations just to make it a little bit easier?
Sorry, 3.3.3 A and B in the Barker and Associates report, which is attachment 4. 3.3.3, and it's A and B. It's page 14 of their report, page 139 of our attachment agenda. It's the SCP analysis report.
They will be carried through into the final FDS is what they're proposed.
So if I can just, but on page 22 of our agenda, it says no changes to the draft FDS are recommended as a result of the issues raised by submitters on this theme. And so based on that, I didn't see that these were being picked up. And I didn't see commentary.
Just for clarity, we're referring to amending the section 7.1 of the draft FDS to clarify that the rate of intensification assumed is not a target.
Yep.
And that council should aim for a greater proportion of growth to be catered for within the urban area.
Yes.
And the second one is amend the table and the implementation of the draft FDS to clarify that the quarterly monitoring and annual reporting will involve monitoring of the uptake rate of intensification.
Correct. Thank
Right,
you.
thank you.
Yes.
All right.
The
So
councillors on diligent, that's page 216.
all right, go to the officers.
Oh, sorry, we're just having a look through it at the moment. So yes, we do intend to make those changes, but yeah, they haven't made it into the report because we were focusing on, I suppose, the larger, because they're relatively minor tweaks, if you like, rather than fundamental to the theme. I think that's why they've been, well, that is why they haven't been included as a specific, they're not a policy or high level change needed in the document, but happy to consider an additional, adding any additional detail into the resolutions if you think it's needed.
Councillor Ricker.
Thank you for that. Look, I agree they probably don't necessarily warrant resolutions, but I think they definitely warrant noting in the minutes because, you know, they are changes we want to bring through.
Right, so for the purposes of, at this point, what I'm going to do is ask Susan to note that as a discussion point for us as we go through as to whether we want them noted in the minutes or we actually want to resolve them. That will just give members of the panel time to.
Yep. And then I just had my other question that we're waiting on an answer for.
Do we have an answer to the previous question?
Yes, we do. Yeah. So I've had a quick look through the summary document at page 28 explains the FDS summary document at page 28 explains intensification quite well. And if you go through and look at the individual proposals for each town, I've just had a quick look through Wakefield, for example. We talk about intensification around the centre and also greenfield intensification. So, I mean, if we had a bit more time, I can give you more references, but I'm comfortable. I remember that we did draft in an explanation of what they mean.
Councillor Ricker.
Yeah, I know this isn't higher level, but I think it's, you know, it's been a critical area for discussion for submission. So I think, you know, a clear definitions area in the final FDS would be beneficial rather than necessarily breadcrumbs throughout. I think we need to be quite clear up front.
All right. So as I understood the question, it was, had we in our material clearly identified that different housing choice would be part of the greenfield development? So for instance, terrace housing or smaller apartments, was that yes, discussion, yes, retirement villages, all those sorts of things. So essential vertical living.
So in the greenfield areas, there's a typology associated with them, G1 through to G6 off the top of my head. And they all have different typologies associated with them, different housing types. What they don't do is, you know, to simplify the analysis to the point where we're capable of providing some useful numbers, we haven't gone down the path of providing different typologies within the same area. Inherent in that typology is the assumption that there will be a variety of different housing types that are developed. Certainly not the only type that's going to be is assumed for that area, and that's that really does come down to us not being able to. Essentially, we end up pretending we're more accurate than we are, if you like, by going into that extra detail, which isn't helpful, I don't think, in the long run.
All right. So can I just ask a follow-up question? In that case, what assumption did you make in terms of potential yield you've gone through, you've done yield assumptions as you've gone through the different areas that have been proposed. And I think what we're trying to do is just understand at the level below that, how was that calculated, and did it include a range of different housing typologies and density.
I'll just hand off to Cam, if that's
Thank you,
all right.
Thank you. So within the document, there's a number of sites classified as greenfield. Some of those sites do not assume a range of typologies. So essentially anything classified G2 to G6. The G1 typology, the description is a mix of detached and some attached typologies, e.g. terraces and duplexes, with an average lot size of 275 metres squared. So essentially that was trying to capture the development that you're seeing in the likes of Richmond West, where we are starting to see rows of terraces and duplexes, more intensive forms of living within those fairly typical greenfield subdivisions where you might have the larger lots as well. So at that level, we have broadly taken into account for some of the greenfield areas, some of the other greenfield areas further out, say in Wakefield, Pigeon Valley was an example where we had assumed fairly large lots, very typical residential type subdivision patterns, but where we were close to the centre, we were assuming some level of intensification that was reflected in the density numbers for those particular sites.
Thank you for that clarification. So the panel's clear. So if it's G1, it might have duplexes and terraces. If it's G2 to 6, it doesn't have any form of intensification included in it. All right, thank you. I'll move on to Councillor McGurk.
Yes, quick question, probably a similar theme, I guess. And I just the sort of in the existing urban area, we've got sort of a fragmented land tenure system. So I suppose the question is, how's that influenced the uptake rate, or does that present a constraint or an opportunity in terms of calculating that 15%?
Thank you, Councillor McGurk. That's partially reflected in our kind of conservative 15% uptake. We can't take into account the individual motivations of a particular landowner. We can say, yep, you can build a 6-storey apartment on your land, but it doesn't force someone to do that. So inevitably, some people will relish the opportunity, they'll take it up. Some people, I'm happy with my house, I'll live in it. So that's why we erred slightly on the side of caution. There's also practical limitations, getting funding and financing. It's not necessarily easy for people to go get a large a mortgage to fund a new apartment building. So you need kind of commercial property developers. So that's supposed to be reflected in the slightly conservative figure of that 15% uptake rate, which we adopted.
So just taking this a little bit further, if you've got different land tenures, different owners, is there a way that you can calculate sort of aggregating up the size? So if you're looking at a sort of a larger development, it needs a larger site. But if it's got different owners, is there a way that you can sort of calculate the aggregation of those sort of fragmented tenures to enable that kind of development? Could that be, was that just something
My comment would be that wouldn't be a simple exercise, and I can't think off the top of my head how we would do that. The density assumptions we have made for intensification, however, do rely on a degree of site aggregation. So if there was no site aggregation to occur, the level of capacity we are forecasting via intensification would be unlikely to be realised.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ogilvie.
I'm not very keen on the word assumption being repeated, Madam Chair. I think we ought to be more definite in terms of some of our, if you like, requirements of developers. I mean, it's one thing to ask a developer to have a certain degree of intensification, but shouldn't we not have some design schedule in place in terms of section sizes, width of roads, even cycle lanes? So we are getting into detail in terms of developments, whether it be Wakefield, Richmond, or wherever, so that we get some degree of assurance and not assumption as to what's going to happen as a result of the FTS. I think that's coming through from some of these submissions as well. We want more definite requirements rather than just, assume that the developer is going to do the right thing, because very often they don't or can't or won't.
Councillor Oglevie, I'm going to direct that question to Jackie.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So just on the section size point, it might be helpful to clarify that certainly within Tasman, we've selected the intensification areas using criteria such as section sizes. So what we look for are areas that have large sections which have got capacity to be either infilled or redeveloped. And the Croucher Street area would be the best example that we have in Richmond, which is where we've seen most intensification to date, where a lot of the sections are over 1,000 square metres. So we know that there's a feasible chance of intensification actually being able to occur on those sites.
Thank you. Could I just test though, Councillor Oglevie, were you referring more to greenfield sites as opposed to brownfield development? I'll just get you to pop your microphone up.
Yes, I was, yes.
All right, thank you. So just in terms of greenfield.
I think one thing is that's whenever we're looking to the future for pretty much anything, and essentially we are modelling a potential future here of increased, a little bit of greenfield expansion and intensification. There is always uncertainty, and so you have to make assumptions. There is no real way around that. The uptake rate itself, there are assumptions built into that, and that's inherent in that process of developing a model of pretty much anything. As to the rules that would come, to try and realise that density, if you like, in those greenfield areas, that's certainly not something that would happen at the future development strategy stage. That's at a plan change level, and you'll be aware of the Nelson Tasman Land Development Manual, any changes that would come out of that. So that would be sort of the next stage down, if you like.
I think Councillor Oglevie is raising, and I think we're going to come to this as we go through our deliberations. But I think what Councillor Oglevie is raising is a common theme that we saw in the submissions, is that our submitters are looking for more from the councils in terms of directing and enabling a range of typologies for housing, in a desire to see on the greenfield subdivision sites, if there are going to be some, that opportunities for intensification are realised. So I think as we go through, we're going to have to think about, if we feel that that is a view that's shared by the panel, how we're going to communicate that through to the councils. And I know it sounds a bit odd that we are members of the council, but I'm talking as we will give recommendations to the councils. For the purposes of today, we have to see ourselves as a slightly separate body, although we're part of those institutions as we go through making our recommendations through, because we certainly don't have the powers through the future development strategy to be giving directions on plan changes or structure plans. All we can do is make recommendations. I'll come across to Councillor Mayling. Did you wish to make a comment or a question?
I just agree with that. I think we need to keep in mind that this is a high-level strategy. And if I think about the work that is going on for Richmond South, which is a structure plan that will come to council in the future, that is where that detail is going to be put in terms of density, medium density, and we're also talking commercial activities and linkages with cycleways, walkways, and our cycling and walking strategy that we had last week. So I want to make sure that we keep this at a high level and don't get bogged down in the detail, because this is 30 years out. Things will change significantly and it will be reviewed numerous times in that time.
Thank you. Going to Ms. Edwards.
Thank you. Just following on from Councillor Mayling, this is a high-level strategy. It doesn't zone things. It doesn't put rules in place. It doesn't do any of that type of thing. That comes through other mechanisms, through the Nelson Environment Plan and what will be the Tasman Environment Plan as well. So what we've tried to do, and we may not have done this adequately, is to capture, if you look at recommendation 7 in your agenda, we've tried to encapsulate that view that the community wanted us to look at different look at things like inclusionary zoning and making a range of section sizes mandatory in plan changes and plan reviews. So we've tried to capture that as a recommendation through to the new two councils, because of the fact that that's not something we can actually do within the scope of the future development strategy. If that wording doesn't encapsulate what you want it to, or doesn't go far enough, then please let us know, and we can play around with some wording and try and make it more what you're actually after. But hopefully that was what recommendation 7 was designed to try and do, to capture the essence of the submitters' views, that we need to look more towards those other options when we're actually doing our plan changes and plan development.
So Councillor Ogilvie.
Yes, thanks again, Madam Chair. And that's the balance that Susan has indicated that I think we ought to be looking at. And it's the link between the FDS and the council's own plan change proposals and development, which is the key. And I think even though we are high level, we can give not a directive, but a direction for councils. And we've got to be doing that really, I think, much more purposefully than we've done so in the past. Whether it be, otherwise, how are we going to get a 50% update? How are we going to get greenhouse gas emissions reduced at the FDS? We've got to give some sort of, I think, quite direct guideline to both councils and to developers through the councils. Otherwise, the FDS are going to achieve very, very little other than words.
I think that's going to be a very important part of our deliberations, Councillor Ogilvie, and we're going to probably come back to that theme on a number of occasions till we get to our final decisions. Kia ora, I know I see you have your hand up.
Oh, kia ora koutou. So I give my apologies, please. I have to pack up my hotel room and also travel up to Mapua and be with the hapu.
Kia ora, I know I want to wish you, I hope today goes well for you personally, for the hapu. I want to acknowledge the very essence of what you're bringing to the hearing, and it's important that we take heed of what you were saying to us as we go through our deliberations process, and we'll make sure that the timing is structured so that you will be present for discussion of those areas.
Oh, kia ora, Madam Mayor. I really appreciate this, because today I will be discussing the actual fundamental issues with the hapu in regards to what's happening in those sites of significance. I know from my blood descendancy as a tohunga matakete, I really didn't want to expose myself to you all. But it has happened, and so you need to be aware that it's in my bloodline. And so spiritual events and experiences are very real to Māori, in particular to myself. So what's happening on Rabbit Island, Motoroa, is that you've planted forestry in that area on top of urapa. Now, those tupuna, the ancient warriors, they are now being seen running through that forest and haunting anyone who sees them. There have been incidences, the hapu have talked about it. So they've been sent over there to bless that area. Fundamentally, those urapa, the tupuna would like that, where the urapa are, work with the hapu to plant native back on top of those urapa so they're never disturbed again. That's what's happening. Those urapa are being disturbed. The ancient tupuna are now uprising and showing themselves in that particular area where the wharf development is, where the cafes, art galleries and bars are. Now, there was an ancient warrior there found from the 1700s with his head chopped off, still holding on to a taiaha. I wasn't comfortable actually going to that area, and I was fine, but yet I hopped out of the car and I was, I did get impacted, right? I got sick. Those areas are really highly charged, and that tupuna spirit is still there. That's who we're going to go and meet and bless. And there's a lot of unsettled spirits in that area, which are wreaking havoc to all people, Māori and non-Māori. So look, I'll stop in this conversation now and go and do what I need to do today and then join you from Auckland. But look, God bless you all. It's been fantastic knowing you all, and I thoroughly enjoyed my day with you, Kit. It was so valuable, and I certainly understand the compassion and the aroha and the determination to make sure that not only all people are housed, but in the right areas so that food's grown, our environment is looked after. Those sites of significance is so vital to look after, because this area itself, this area was the first settlement of Kupe. And so there are a lot of highly charged tohunga and tapu areas in this area, which are alive. So on that note, aroha nui, and I'll see you online tomorrow. Kia ora.
Aroha nui, Aina. Go well. Go well. Kia ora koutou to the panel. I just want to really acknowledge what Aina has shared with us today. These are sites of cultural significance, and the issues that she's raising are critically important as we go through our deliberations. So it is important that she is here when we get to discussing these areas. I think what Aina is bringing is not is specific to the areas that she has visited, but the issues are important to all of us as we make decisions in local government. And I think we just need to be really mindful of that as we go through our process today, but also in the work we do every day. We'll take a morning tea break at about 10:30. So I think we can probably do a little bit more now on the topics that are in front of us. If we have anyone that needs to has got time constraints, then I'll just hopefully someone could just pass me up a note or let me know if we're getting to the point where we're running out of time for particular presentations. Now, where did I get to in our speaking order? We finished with Councillor Ogilvie. If we can just bring me back to the topic that we're discussing at the moment, which is the housing land capacity and uptake rate. And I need to see if we've got any more commentary from the officers. I think Chris may be able to respond to Councillor Egar's earlier question. Or have we done that?
Well, there is one more issue that, or one more piece of information that might be useful. Cam has done some additional analysis around what the outcomes of different range of uptake rates might be, and I think that'd be useful to if he talked to that.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. Kim, just before you start, one thing we do need to capture as we go through is there has been supplementary material circulated, and so if the officers can just keep an eye on that, and if we're at a topic area where supplementary material has been circulated, we'll just need to address that as we go through, so that we can introduce that into the meeting. Kia ora, Kim.
Thank you. So this additional work follows up a comment and request made by Councillor Egar last week around what if we're a bit more ambitious around intensification, or if kind of the upside uptake rate is higher than we're expecting. So we wanted to look at it by breaking down by both decades, so decades 1 to 3, and also the typology type. So when we're talking about the typologies, medium density typologies, what we're talking about are low rise, typically timber, lightweight buildings. They're relatively easy to construct. There's quite large capacity in the building industry to do that. And then that compares to kind of your higher density mixed use typologies, above 3 stories, we have more complex structures, typically concrete or steel on the construction. So they're a bit more complicated, a bit more expensive, and a bit more kind of difficult in terms of feasibility. So what we've done is we've kind of provided slightly different uptake rates across those on the decades, basically saying a slower uptake from day one, but as that capacity builds within the industry, as you go through plan changes, you enable more height, that uptake rate essentially increases because it becomes a known quantity, it's more favourable to the market. So on page 188 of the attachment of submissions hearing, I set out those 2 scenarios. So essentially we're looking at kind of more increased uptake rates for medium density typologies and the high density ones, but at slightly different uptake rates across those decades. So we did the two different scenarios. Scenario one was the kind of more conservative, and it was largely consistent with the 15% flat rate across the 30 years. Number two was assuming a much greater uptake of higher density uses in decade three in particular. And what that kind of showed is using the methodology, potential for around 1,700 additional dwellings to be delivered via intensification over the life of the FDS, with the majority of that occurring in decade three. So that 1,700 is around 7% of the 24,000 homes required. So if essentially if intensification rates are higher than the 15% projected, and there is wider uptake, it can make a meaningful difference in the required capacity for the housing requirements over those 30 years. Obviously, with most of that loaded kind of post 2040 in this scenario. So that was, I think, worth pointing out. There is a table on the following page 189, which kind of sets out some of those numbers there and compares it with the 15% flat rate that we presented in the draft FDS. So yeah, that's kind of the additional information that we prepared in the last few days.
Thank you, Cam. Any questions on that analysis and that scenario, the two scenarios that were run?
Just a very quick one. Is that quick enough? The third decade seems a long way away, particularly for me. But now, seriously, are we not really demanding more of the intensification than even in the third decade?
Well, Councillor Ogilvie, I'll go to the officers, but I think this is the part where we need to see some other tools to achieve a faster uptake. And what we're going to need to get it is we're going to need a range of interventions. The plan development process, the resource management plans are going to be critical. There may be financial strategies that are going to be needed. There are going to have to be infrastructure plans that are supporting that work. So I think there are a range of things, and they're captured in the recommendations to some degree, and we might want to amplify those a bit as we go through. But I guess what we should ask the officers is, given what you know, so are you taking into account the plan change processes that you're aware of? So that would be one thing, noting that they can take an extraordinarily long time to get to a conclusion. But you've seen signals from both councils around supporting greater density. Are there any other, what sort of factors have you taken into account in reaching that sit behind the assumptions?
So I think it's one of the things that we've, an additional piece of information or additional piece of work that we did quite early on was to look at what Nelson and Tasman's current uptake rates are under their current planning framework. And for Nelson, that was lower than the 15%. And so inherent in that 15% is an assumption that there will be an increase in uptake rate as a result of a plan change. Again, as you point out, these things take a fair amount of time, and we're unsure about how dramatic they're going to be. Are they going to be incremental over the 30 years? Or are we likely to see quite a large change? Factoring also, as Cam said, the capabilities of our current construction, not just capabilities, but also their capacity to deliver those larger buildings. That's going to need time to respond as well to any changes in plan. In the Nelson plan or in planning for Tasman as well. And then layering again on top of that, we don't really have we'd be absolutely guessing if we tried to predict what the financial systems would be looking like in even 10 years' time as far as the risk profiles of the banks and their willingness to lend to developers. So that's why we have, if you like, pulled back. We are being conservative, we think, with the 15%, but I don't think we're being unreasonably conservative given that we have to, the NPSUD currently requires us to do a 3-yearly review of so we have an opportunity to monitor the effect of these changes and then respond to them.
Thank you, Chris. Is there any comparative that you want to discuss with us? So if you're looking at that uptake rate, we've had a little bit of a discussion about Wellington, I think, what that looks like. Are there any others that you would reflect on to say, well, actually, we could look not just in Nelson, Tasman, but we could look elsewhere and go that looks like it's a reasonable.
Yeah, so as Curtin mentioned in his when he was talking earlier, he's compared Christchurch and Wellington. It's still in Curtin. I was just wondering whether Curtin could expand on that.
That would be helpful. Thanks, Curtin.
So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of ready-made comparators. I think what we need to be aware of is the large policy change that went through at the end of last year. And so that really precludes being able to access a number of studies, a number of other FDS that would have looked at this issue by now. So that puts us in it's not ideal from being able to draw from a lot of other councils for this type of analysis. Having set that to one side, then I think the work that we did do with the MDRS CDA, that is, takes into account that large policy change, so that is relevant. And also the Wellington study does give us a kind of a reasonable recent comparator, even though that doesn't take into account that MDRS policy change.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I'll come to Councillor Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I guess my question in relation to all of what we've just heard is that this is going to take quite a cultural change in developers, builders and purchasers, and it's not going to happen quickly. So, and other than the things that perhaps Councillor Ogilvie talked about that we could encourage the council to do, we're sort of stuck between a bit of a rock and a hard place. We can put 15%. Reality is it's going to be somewhere in that order, perhaps up to 25 uptake over time, because it's going to be a long lead in time, I suspect.
Yeah, I think there will be definite lead in time. What I can reflect in working in the Auckland market, where I guess there's been some stronger intensification directives over the past 10 to 20 years, even now where significant housing opportunities are enabled in their apartment housing zone, it's very common where developers will just come in with a terraced housing scheme at significantly lower densities because they are within a housing market where they are competing with detached housing. So they need to be kind of comparable in terms of price. So even if you're enabling it, it does take time for the market to get comfortable with that. And Auckland's kind of just moving from that transition to terraced housing to apartment style living as being more common. And so you're seeing more 3-story to 6-story apartment buildings. And that really took 10 to 15 years of a lot of terraced housing development to kind of get to that point where the market was more comfortable with smaller property sizes, smaller house sizes. So I definitely believe there is a definite lead in time to get the high levels of intensification.
Got any quick answers for making that lead in time shorter? Just takes time.
If I could just maybe add, both councils did their intensification action plans following the last future development strategy. We adopted those in 2020 and they list out a number of actions that the councils themselves can take to try and improve the uptake of intensification. And that was things such as discounts for development contributions for small homes, the creation of greenways in intensification areas where we try and remove some of the on-street parking and improve amenity for people living there with planting. We also try to streamline some of the consent guidance to make it easier for people to understand to get their consent. So there are a range of actions that the councils can undertake, and we'll be looking to review those plans after this FDS.
For you, but they're separate to this process, aren't they?
Well, they're really a sub-strategy of the FDS. It's an implementation component of the FDS, yeah.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. I think between a rock and a hard place is a bit how we feel on this one at the moment, that if we wish we had the magic wand to make this go faster, but I think what we're hearing is that there's nothing here. I guess the question I have is there anything, given the knowledge that you have from other parts of New Zealand, that would say that we have a distinguishing feature that would allow us to move at a faster pace than Auckland is, essentially? Is there some attribute that says, actually, if you're going to be the place that speeds up intensification, it's going to be Nelson Tasman? We're getting a lot of shaking heads.
There's a lot of shaking heads around the table. Yeah, at this end of the table. Yeah, I think. Yeah, Cam, do you want to?
I think size is probably a relevant issue in terms of the market. So I know in Auckland, the likes of Fletcher Construction have got big factories set up in Wiri where they're essentially doing modulated apartment buildings. So essentially they can build in a factory 24/7, ship it out to a site in Auckland, and that kind of speeds it up. So that type of infrastructure I'm not aware of is present in Nelson, and I suspect it's unlikely to be present in Nelson because there's the demand for total housing. So there are other factors like that which can make intensification faster, which the likes of Auckland benefits from just purely from its size, which is always going to be a distinguishing factor for somewhere like Auckland in comparison to other areas.
Cam, yes, it's a whole system, isn't it? From right through from the land to the design to the construction to who's going to do the work. Councillor Edgar. Look, apologies, this is probably just a slight aside, but just there was a comment earlier that TDC is having a greater pickup of intensification than NCC. I was just wondering if there's been any analysis of the intensification action plans and the strategies that may have been an enabling factor for more intensification in Tasman versus Nelson, because if there is, then Nelson need to look at what we should be doing differently.
So through you, Mayor, it's really largely due to the fact that we had our plan change for intensification in Richmond that became operative at the end of 2018. Whereas I understand in Nelson, the rules are still being worked on to a grade to enable more intensification. So we're able to see that actually taking place now and monitor the area that the rules enable intensification in. And that's what we use to inform the evidence that Cam referred to before. So I think that's the main difference, is that some of our rules for Richmond, not for the rest of the district, but for Richmond have been in place longer.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's helpful for our housing choice plan change.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Nayling.
Yeah, just following on from what Jackie just said, we're certainly seeing improvements in Richmond because of Rita, but people would like it to go a little bit further, to be honest, because the comment we get from developers, as soon as it becomes a significant resource consent hearing, they tend to back off a little bit. And I think I've seen that with one in Salisbury Road at the moment. But in terms of the intensification in greenfields, the comment I'd make, the significant change has been the cost of commuting that we've seen in the last 6 months. The price of fuel has gone to the roof, and it's happened around the world, and I don't see it going back. So I think that will actually aid what happens. And I'm reasonably familiar with the northern part of the Auckland market, where there's apartments where my son used to live, and out to the coast, where they built a lot of those townhouses attached, and they're 4 bedrooms and 2 stories. But we'd call them an apartment because they're in a block, like a Coronation Street, but very flash. But I think the cost of commuting will drive and will aid Nelson City, particularly with developments going forward, because I don't see that changing. And when you're now putting in $100, $150 a week in fuel into your vehicle, that will drive people's behaviour. And I think we'll see that right around the country. But putting it in this, I don't think we can, but I think that will drive the change.
Thank you, Councillor Mailing. We're probably going to have to keep that in mind as we go through, as we start to look at our sites and think about the emissions reduction that we need to be focusing on. I think that's a reasonable and proper place to be having that discussion. I just wanted to round this uptake rate conversation off. So have we got any further questions on uptake? I've just got one, which was there was a we did have a submission from Kāinga Ora that was supported by Property Economics, and I see that you've had some discussions with Tim Heath and Phil Osborne, or maybe just Phil Osborne, just around a different view on this matter of uptake. And they, I think they're still of the view that it is too conservative. I just want to sort of tease that discussion out. So who's best to have that? Thanks, Cam.
So I guess there's probably two components with the Kāinga Ora discussion. One was would we actually get the 15% uptake rate with the amount of greenfield land that was proposed as part of it? So in one sense, if all that greenfield land was to come forward, you actually might see less than the 15% from intensification. It might make it more difficult to deliver the level of intensification anticipated. The second point was just generally about the uptake rate. So we had a long conversation about this. We wanted to, even a specific number that we could kind of test and understand. The only comment was really that they would have expected it to be higher, but that the 15% wasn't a wholly unreasonable number, albeit at the lower end of what they considered to be likely.
What was their upper end? So what was their range?
They didn't provide it. They just said that the 15% was at the lower end.
All right.
Basically, it was a very complicated piece of work that they kind of didn't have the time or the budget to prepare as part of their submission on the FDS. So it was more speaking in generalizations.
All right, thank you. All right, any other questions on this one? I think probably just thinking about the conversations and the answer, one of the things that I will be turning my mind to in this is to whether you have understated the uptake rate in the greenfield subdivision, greenfield opportunity. So probably that's one of the things that I will be turning my mind to, and just listening to how you approach the G1s through G6s or 7s. So I might just have a consideration around that. In terms of materiality, are you able to give me, any advice if I was to say to you, well, I think you haven't provided enough through the greenfield areas? I'd probably then refer, I think, Cam, to the work that you've done, that you directed us to on pages 188 and 189. And I guess that's a temporal thing as well. So you're looking at the outer years. So there's a little bit of discussion in my mind, thinking about this as to whether we can go faster and whether there's enough provision within those greenfield areas for intensified living in terms of the way you approach the calculation. I'm just thinking out loud, but that's what I'm still contemplating. So that I think apart from that, I think you've covered the areas very well. Just see if there are any further questions, Councillor Edgar.
This question, I am looking at theme 6, which is the greenfield, brownfield, which I know is our next section, but 12.22.2 in the report, talks about putting the intensification split a different way. And if I've read this correctly, the 67% intensification is because you're now taking into account the greenfield intensification. And so does that then have any impact on the 15%, or how that could be put a different way if that 15% is only reliant on infill and brownfield?
In terms of that difference in calculation, it's probably to make it more consistent with how other FDS's kind of, or spatial plans report. It's the 67% within essentially the urban area. So that's zoned land, which is currently sitting vacant as well, which we had said is brand new greenfield development, which wasn't actually necessarily correct. That land, which is already zoned for residential purposes, you kind of want to make the best use of it and get as many homes as you can out of it as well. So that comes back to kind of your point and discussions raised around trying to get more intensive typologies on that greenfield land, because it's easier. Essentially, it's easier to do from the outset than piecemeal infill development. So that's kind of partially reflective of the way we're trying to discuss the the split between intensification and greenfield. It's not necessarily just a straight, this is intensification, this is greenfield. There are different types of greenfield, and essentially decisions have previously been made to enable greenfield development, and we're not proposing to essentially take that greenfield development away. So we just wanted to be a bit clearer around how that was reported.
And so if we did include the greenfield as you have here, or the intensifiable elements of the greenfield as you have here, what does that do to the uptake rate?
I don't think it does. I don't think it necessarily changes the uptake rate. I think that was partially why we've taken the conservative approach with that 15%, because we wanted to reflect that there are kind of complexities over time and areas and different development types. So that's why we overall took an approach as a project team to be slightly on the more conservative side of that uptake rate, so we could get something which we believe was more realisable potentially.
Okay, thank you.
Right, that probably concludes that. We're happy to conclude that question and answer session. Will we take a morning tea break now? I think we will, and then we'll come back as long as that works for everybody. And next up, we'll do the greenfield, brownfield housing capacity split, because there's been quite a lot of submissions on this one, so we need to get that sorted out. Curtin, are you able to stay with us this morning? Because we will need you there for that discussion.
Yeah, for sure. See you after the break.
Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break and then we'll be back. Welcome back to our future development strategy deliberations. We are now going to move on to the topic greenfield, brownfield housing capacity split. And I'll just, Jackie, would you like to open that topic for us, please?
Yes, thanks, Mary. Will do. Okay, so this is theme 6 in the officer's report at page 37. So there were about 3 different questions in the questionnaire in our consultation document that we're seeking views from the community on their thoughts on our greenfield, brownfield split in the draft FDS. We asked people where they would like to see growth over the next 30 years, what they thought of the balance in our draft strategy, and if they didn't like the balance, what their proposals were instead. So there's quite a strong response to this. We had, in relation to one question, 43% of people wanted to see growth occurring via intensification. Interestingly, 21% also wanted to see growth in Tasman's rural towns, the existing rural towns. In terms of our balance between greenfield and intensification, 70% of people disagreed with that split. And in terms of where people would like to see growth instead, there was a clear preference for intensification. So 50% wanted to see more intensification and 34% would propose less greenfield expansion. So that was the sort of headlines from the recent consultation on the FDS. I think it's fair to say that we weren't surprised by this. This echoes previous views on the 2019 FDS, where we had about 84% of people for that survey wanted to accommodate growth by building up, as opposed to building out or starting from scratch with a new town. In terms of other evidence, which is interesting to think about for this topic, what we tend to find is when we ask the community where they would like to accommodate growth, the answer is pretty much always intensification. But when we do surveys such as the Housing We Choose survey last year in our urban environment across Nelson and Tasman, what we find when we ask people where they would like to live is the reverse. So for that survey of 600 people, in Tasman, 70% of the respondents prefer a standalone dwelling, only 24% would prefer an attached dwelling, and 5% an apartment. And in Nelson, 64% of the respondents preferred a standalone dwelling, so slightly less than Tasman. It's also interesting to note that 28% of people couldn't afford to buy any dwelling at all, or rent anything actually, for that matter. So this actually echoes kind of national surveys that we've seen in Wellington and Dunedin as well, where you generally find about 80% of respondents would prefer to live in a standalone dwelling. And it shows that the predisposition for New Zealanders is a single-storey detached house at the moment. Often that's because they want more privacy, more garden space, or more outdoor space. So that's a bit of background on what we found from surveys. I'm going to bring in Curden because he's done some work on the Greenfield Brownfield split too. He's also looked at some historical rates on expansion in Tasman and how the FDS compares with that. And then we might just go to Cam as well, who can maybe just run through his Greenfield intensification split and how that's changed slightly. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. We'll come across to you, Curtin.
Thank you. So I can make a few comments around kind of the greenfields, brownfields kind of split and how some context for how you might want to think about this. So one thing that I think is important is that if we want an FDS that responds to kind of the direction and the national policy statement on urban development, then it needs to have kind of certain features or kind of address the objectives of that kind of a document or that national direction. That's not law, but it may well be that you want an FDS that kind of meets that national direction. And one objective that I think is missed in a lot of the submissions that came through is this kind of objective 2. Objective 2 of the NPS for urban development talks about competition, and it talks about planning decisions that improve housing affordability by supporting competitive land and housing markets. And what that's really saying is, let's not just choose one type of housing development, be it greenfields or intensification, that we might need both of those markets to actually improve housing affordability. So that's one lens that I think is missing from a lot of the submissions, but I think that council and staff was kind of front of mind when they're putting together the FDS. So that's an important point, I think, to realise when we think about what that FDS might look like. Another point that perhaps didn't come through in the submissions as well is that there were submissions that said this FDS doesn't prioritise intensification. And we can reach different viewpoints about how much greenfield development or how much brownfields, but just as a point of fact, the multi-criteria analysis that the staff kind of go through does actually prioritise intensification over other developments. And it does that by the weights that kind of developments that have these kind of characteristics of intensification, good access to public transport, etc., take a higher weight relative to other developments. So just as a matter of fact, the FDS does prioritise intensification. Kind of a second point is many of the submissions actually suggested, look, let's not do greenfields, let's intensify first. And if we do greenfields, what happens is that prices will go down and we'll never do kind of brownfields and intensification. And that might be a policy choice that council want to adopt, but let's be clear that what we're really saying is that if we do fewer kind of greenfield developments, house prices would be higher than they would otherwise need to be. And by keeping sort of land and house prices high, that would allow more intensification to occur. You might want to reach a policy judgment that that's actually kind of speaks to the outcomes that people want. That's fine, but let's not pretend that house prices will be somehow magically not increased because we're not doing those developments. What we're really saying is, in the submissions, if only house prices were a bit higher, then we'd be able to realise that intensification. I think that's an important point to kind of realise. One piece of work that I kind of did in responding to some of those submissions was actually sort of take a look at kind of the intensification of land use, both for Tasman and Nelson over history. And I include that, I think it's on page 182, I compare that comparison. In the past, Tasman has used a lot of land to accommodate a lot of people. But if we look at sort of what's dialed into the draft FDS, that certainly is pared back quite substantively. And so Tasman wouldn't be using land as extensively as it has in the past, and that's also true of Nelson. So you are getting already sort of intensification right across those districts from the draft FDS. Now, you know, you may want to reach another kind of judgment about what's appropriate, but that's just sort of contextual information for what the draft FDS kind of contains at the moment. I think that's about all. I guess I've really come from this from a perspective of not targeting a specific brownfield, greenfield percentage. Is really that's a sort of an outcome of the draft FDS. One comment that I think has caused a little bit of confusion is allowing greenfields would actually, reduces the intensification of kind of the district as a whole. I provided a long report for Tasman on greenfields development, and within that report, I made the point that that's not true of everywhere on all sites, and that there will be some brownfield sites that actually people want to intensify as that land price goes down. And I think that's been misconstrued or misunderstood as saying by doing greenfields, you actually increase brownfields, and that's not true. It's just that for some particular sites, they will actually get developed. So if we do allow greenfields, it's not that no more brownfields development will ever occur. So I can take questions and see where we go from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Curtin. I think we'll just start with that last point. So this is the part that I really want to clear up, is that we've had commentary in some of the submissions that's been supported by other economists, Fraser Colgrave, and also just I want to reflect on the property economics material that came in from Kāinga Ora. So I just want to understand, so it seems to be a range of views, but also some criticism around the idea that greenfield land supply improves the likelihood of intensification. And I think that's just the topic you were covering. So I just want to be really clear on that in terms of what your position is. And you'll have read the commentary, and so I'm interested in your response to that on that particular point.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. When we have greenfields development, that means that I guess the urban form does take up more land. It's more expensive, and across the inner city, you won't get as much development as you would otherwise. The point I was making in that paper is that there will be some more development within that inner city. So some sites will intensify, and you will see development even though you have greenfields. But as a general statement, it's simply true that if you have more greenfields, then across kind of the city form or the urban area overall, you'll have less intensification that you would otherwise. And I think that's where the difference between Fraser's comments and my comments are. Fraser looks at that as a general statement, and I'm saying for some specific sites, it will be the case that when land is a little bit cheaper, they will be developed, even though greenfields is cheaper overall.
But let's say that prices is neutral, then the more greenfield land there is, well, I wouldn't say the more, but increasing greenfield supply, it doesn't incentivize intensification, does it?
No. Simply the case that will mean that land prices for intensification close to the city centre will be lower, but you will have these greenfields that have been realised and developed. So the urban form is perhaps more spread out, but there will be some sites within the inner city that, because land prices are a little bit lower, that they would be developed. Okay, but clearly, we've got more greenfields, so we've got more kind of the urban form is more spread out as a whole.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the general versus the specific site.
Specific, all right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Any questions at this point for Jackie or Curtin? Councillor Eager?
Thank you. 12.4 in the officer's report, and then also page 170 in the attachment. Can you tell me, because I couldn't see if they'd taken into account the fact that developers essentially choose when to release land onto the market. They can hold it for decades, and they're quite strategic in that
release onto the market so as to maximise price, and the impact of that on your findings. And the other potential impact is that in our market, we have very few developers controlling quite a lot of the market. So what do you see as the impact of that, and have you considered those elements in your findings? So that's either to Jackie, Chris, or to Curtin.
So through the Mayor, I think the first query was relating to the meeting notes of the property economics. Am I right? Paragraph 12.4 you said?
12.14.
Oh, 14, sorry, hang on.
It's just about releasing greenfield land reduces the cost of the land, reduces the cost of housing, predominantly by increasing the supply of housing in greenfield areas within the regions. And so it's just that, you know, when you talk about release of land, are you taking into account that that's very much developer led and they choose when to do it so as to maximise their return?
So that's probably a question for Curtin, because I think it's related to what he was talking about before. But I mean, certainly landowners do and will bank land. That's the way the property market works. And yeah, through our monitoring reports, under the MPSUD, we know that we have a lot of land in the ownership of a relatively small number of people. I think from memory, it was 65% of zoned land in the Nelson urban area is owned by 10 companies. So yeah, that's undoubtedly a factor here. But Curtin, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, so I think that was kind of one of the core kind of themes of a longer report that I wrote for Tasman a while back now. And yeah, thinking about land release is certainly important, and thinking about the proclivity for developers to develop a land bank. So I'm quite encouraging for releasing a reasonable amount of greenfields land to kind of move away from prevent those opportunities from occurring for developers to land bank, and sort of slowly release land that would only increase prices of land and hence increase prices of housing. I agree that Tasman does have perhaps fewer developers and landowners than would be ideal, but there are certainly other areas within New Zealand that would have less competitive land markets in terms of even fewer landowners. And I know that from a large piece of work for the National Policy Direction of Urban Development capacity that was sort of 5 years old, where we looked through at the ownership structure of New Zealand's leading urban areas. And so that's certainly an important thing to think about, and would encourage releasing a substantial amount of greenfields rather than sort of going through a sequence approach.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Curtin? Councillor Mailing.
Well, it's not a question, it's a discussion really with Councillor Edgar. And unless we become a developer, how do we control that? So we've seen sections here in Richmond where they release about 75 at a time. And in the past, it used to be only 20 or 30, and I'm thinking in Richmond South along Hart Road. And those sections are gone within hours. And they're gone within hours within the property companies that buy them, or the building companies that buy the bulk of them. And it becomes very, very difficult for individuals to buy them. But there are some people that are able to do that. They have to act very quickly. And there is a range of prices for that land as well. It isn't all expensive. I've seen, certainly with some developers, the prices have been a bit cheaper. But unless we actually become a developer, I don't see how we control that.
I guess my question was, have those assumptions been taken into account in the analysis and the information we've been provided? And then secondary, is there anything within the scope of the FDS that we can do that might mitigate those exact facts? Yes.
All right, let's see if we can get an answer to those two questions.
So through the Mayor, I don't think we could take into account when land is going to be released because it's outside of our control.
I don't think that's the point, Jackie. I'll just go back to...
Yeah, not the when, the fact that developers control it.
You're
The fact that we don't.
You've essentially got an oligopoly operating, and what it's interesting that Curtin is saying to us, it's not dissimilar to other parts of New Zealand where large parts of the land supply are controlled by a small number of people. So I guess this is a question, sorry, Councillor Uga, but it's around if we're applying, market economics to this, we're really sure that we're understanding how it operates, because it's not a completely competitive market in the sense that there are some other factors in here that that allow the oligopoly to basically operate. Curtin.
Yeah, thank you. So it's not an easy problem to deal with. So I sort of appreciate that, and I'm not intending to tell people how to think about this, but there's kind of two things that come to mind. One is the more we can get away from kind of sequencing land release, the better, because as soon as we start kind of sequencing greenfields in terms of it'll be these groups of sites, then 10 years later, this future greenfield site, and then 30 years, this other piece of land, the easier it is for developers to kind of see the path of travel, and that will drive up kind of land prices in the short run. That's not easy. When we release greenfields, it needs to come with infrastructure, and that carries a cost for local council. So I'm certainly mindful of that. Second kind of quite left field policy would be the thinking about what's the extent to which councils can actually use rates on land rather than on the land capital value. Now that's quite a large kind of policy undertaking, but that means that from a developer perspective, holding land with the intent or belief that land prices will go up in the future carries a larger cost than it would if we have land rates based on land and capital.
Thank you, Curtin. Yeah, Councillor Mayling.
That's an interesting thing, because our rates are different from Nelson City, but I think we both have the same problem. So we have a capital-based rating system when Nelson City has a land value-based rating system, but I think we both have similar problems. But what I see, Curtin, and you might comment on this, when we start having discussions about a plan change or zoning more land, the property developers get in very early. And we've already seen that in the last 2 years in Richmond South, where they are approaching landowners up to 10 years before development to secure that land. And whether they do it by actually purchasing it or take an option or an intention to buy, they get control of the land very early. Or would that be a fair comment? Barry, you're seeing that?
Yeah, through the chair, that's right. I guess as an observation, we're not necessarily seeing land banking on greenfield sites around Richmond, given the demand. We know, certainly in terms of greenfield lands, we choose to work directly with the developers to get a good outcome rather than, rather than against them. So certainly we're in active discussions with developers, encouraging higher densities, that sort of thing, before we instigate plan changes. So it's an iterative process, but as an observation, not necessarily seeing land banking per se at the moment on zoned land, but certainly the developers are well ahead of us in terms of land ownership and options.
Thanks, Barry. Well, I think what Barry's just said amplifies what Councillor Ogilvie raised earlier this morning about what happens next and how important it is to actually be engaging in planning through the development process to ensure that there's good urban development outcomes, which is the purpose of the NPS. So noting that we don't have all the tools with us as part of the FDS process. And sorry about all the acronyms. I'm probably going to get worse as we go on. All right, now we also had some discussions with property economics, didn't we, on these matters. So can we just canvass how those discussions went and what the conclusions were? Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Maurice. Yes, we did, following the close of the hearings, we did have 2 meetings with Kāinga Ora and Property Economics. So at the first meeting, Curtin Lees was there and we did talk through all of their submission points, and we did clarify a number of matters which Cam has already spoken to. But just in terms of the matters around the Greenfield-Brownfield split, and the uptake rate. Property economics, this is on page 204 of the attachment. They noted that they do consider that implementation and staging is critical to getting a balanced greenfield brownfield mix. And there was some discussion around that. So in terms of how the FDS can address that, it can deal with that through the implementation plan, which will be a next step following the FDS, which will be an opportunity for both of the councils to jointly undertake that more detailed level of planning around how the greenfield land will be released and coordinated with infrastructure to link in with more detailed infrastructure planning undertaken through long-term plan strategies.
All right, any questions on those discussions? I think we're clear as to how they worked. I think the factor that I'm contemplating at the moment is in relation to the information Jackie gave us before around 28% of people can't afford actually to rent or buy in the market in Nelson Tasman, and Curtin's comments before about the potential use of restricting land supply, but you will have a consequential price implication around that. Is it what I think I'm quite interested in as we go through this, and it might be something we consider, is that actually there is another entity that has the ability to deliver different outcomes here, and it is Kāinga Ora. And in fact, I'm very interested in whether Kāinga Ora is going to play a significant role in actually, in the affordable housing space in this region, because what we can see is that that is one of our big needs, and potentially that is a party that, given the objectives that are sought through the range of government policy statements, that they might wish to play a greater role in terms of enabling intensification and moving that further and faster to achieve some of the outcomes that we're seeking. So I just if we can just make a little note about that, Susan, to come back and consider whether we want to have a particular recommendation in relation to the role of Kāinga Ora and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development at the same time, given we don't have all the tools here. All right, no further questions on the greenfield brownfield split. Jackie, thank you.
A couple more things to add. I probably didn't make it clear enough at the beginning, although Curtin did allude to it. We didn't start with any particular percentage in mind for the greenfield brownfield split. I think some submitters thought that we had set the split and then found the sites to fall into place. Our starting point was to try and find as much capacity as we could through intensification. And in fact, we found that if we only experience a medium growth scenario, we can accommodate nearly all of that growth, if not all of it, through intensification only. But in meeting our obligations under the MPSUD and making sure we have sufficient housing capacity in the next 30 years, as you know, we've also modelled a high growth scenario, and it's the extra demand for housing that causes us problems in terms of capacity. And that's why we do need some greenfield land as well. And I might just pass to Cam because, as I mentioned before, he's done a bit more work on the split itself between intensification and greenfield. You might want to just update on that, Cam.
Thank you, Jackie. I'll just refer you all to page 195, table 3 of the attachments of the submissions hearing. This compares what we put out in the draft FDS document to what we've come through as kind of revisions based on the submissions and further analysis. So really the big difference was how we were considering the greenfield. So we were recommending some general reductions in the amount of greenfield land. There was also loss of capacity in the urban areas itself as a result of removing sites from significant natural hazards or subject to other constraints such as proximity to the airport and the N102 Rodo Street in particular. So there has been a slight drop, but we do have essentially just over 5,000 homes, which are essentially greenfield on existing zone land within both Tasman and Nelson available essentially now. A big portion of that is already infrastructure ready, I understand. So the likes of Richmond West, a lot of Marsden and Ngāwhatu Valley. So there's quite a lot of homes in those which are kind of ready to go now. so that's really been the kind of big difference between the two. Yeah, so minor drop-offs in kind of greenfield and new greenfield sites, as well as very small reductions in intensification, but relying a lot more on the existing zone land that you already have and have set aside for development to reach those numbers. It's probably also worth pointing out we have been optimistic in terms of the greenfield numbers. So we're assuming 100% uptake of greenfield land. So we've got these density assumptions. So we're probably overestimating the likely uptake of greenfield development capacity. And there is a comment there as a comparison. Kapiti Coast and the FDS adopted a 70% uptake for new greenfield growth areas. If we were to take a similar approach, that would drop the overall kind of capacity around the urban areas to that around that 24,000 mark under the high growth scenario.
Any questions on that analysis? Councillor Ika.
Oh, thank you. Just on that table, and Madam Mayor, you might want this discussion now or later when we talk about sites, but I had just wanted to, I guess, look at the rural residential. And of course, in this table, we've now got a proposed increase in rural residential. And I'm just wondering what an increase in rural residential actually signals in the FDS, because I mean, to me, rural residential is probably like the anathema of infill and intensification, to be honest. And so is that something that we should be encouraging more of? Because, you know, I mean, the numbers change quite quickly depending on what you do with rural residential, to be honest. So I just, yeah, and as I said, Madam Mayor, whether it's here or once we get to the sites, but I think it is an overarching discussion that isn't just site specific that I would like to have at some stage.
I think we should do that now. I think it's appropriate. I think we'd sort of canvassed most of the questions on the greenfield, brownfield split. I've got the sense of that. So I think let's have that discussion now, given we've got the table there. So we need to just frame that up. So the question is, well, I guess is rural residential, well, no, I think, as I said, you know, should we be signalling rural residential as a positive land, you know, development model that we want to support and encourage? Right, so and where that sits alongside us trying to support and encourage infill and intensification. Right, and then that should be in the context of the NPS as well, and in the context of what we're trying to achieve through this FDS. Jackie.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll have a go and maybe Cam can add something. I mean, I guess our starting point on this is really, again, going back to those surveys that we've undertaken in the past. The community track surveys that we have done in the past of households in Tasman have also revealed very strong support for lifestyle blocks. It is something which we talked about during the last FDS as well. It's possibly a slight difference between Nelson and Tasman. A lot of people do come to Tasman for the lifestyle blocks and maybe not so much for Nelson. We've also been looking obviously at the MPS UD requirements, and it's clause 3.25 in the implementation section of the MPS UD talks about capacity being quantified in different types, including standalone dwellings and attached dwellings. So the signal there is that we should be providing a range of housing types and choices, and that's always come through quite strongly in the surveys that we've done of our residents as well. So I guess that was the reason for proposing a range of different housing types. I think the small increase in the rural residential housing is due to some sites being removed and some new sites coming in. There's a couple of sites which we can talk about later where we've effectively expanded the rural residential area, and one of those is near Motueka, and there's a little small increase near Pigeon Valley as well in Wakefield, and then there's a St Arnaud site which was rural residential as well. So I think that's why there's a slight increase. The reason for the rural residential site near Mochiweka is because we're really providing very little capacity otherwise in Mochiweka. It's heavily constrained as a town in terms of highly productive land and natural hazards, and it's our most popular place in the district to live according to our housing preferences survey, and it's the place where we actually provide least capacity and have been doing for some time because of those constraints. So that's why we sort of recommended increasing that rural residential area to try and give Mochiweka some more opportunities, really. And if Cam have anything to add?
Probably more as a kind of philosophical point. I'm aligned to Councillor Eaker's thinking personally. There are some benefits, I think, in terms of some rural residential, in that it provides that different lifestyle housing choice, so which is a requirement of the ETS, but it also, and this is possibly a bit more kind of anecdotal, but there's that idea of it frees up different options where people may leave the city and free up that site for development as well, if they've got that kind of other option to kind of move out if they still want that space and they don't like the idea of intensification and those types of things. So there is some trade-offs, although I wouldn't put much weighting on that, but there is clearly some appeal to rural residential living based on the housing preferencing surveys we've seen. So we have tried to accommodate that.
I guess I have a follow-up question then, and look, it's probably in here somewhere. Can someone remind me what's our current, not as in the current draft FDS, but what's our current split or availability of rural residential? Because I guess I'm going, do we actually have a need for more? As a growing trend, or, because we have talked about the ability of, people to be able to, sell or move out of properties, move down, et cetera, that provides opportunities for other people. So, I know neighbours I had in Richmond, a lot of those had moved from the larger lifestyle blocks into now then a smaller standalone block. And so, there is that turnover because probably can't say it because my father's still on a lifestyle block and I'm not allowed to say his age in public. But, typically, as you get older, you might want less land to have to manage. So isn't there enough existing, or is there enough existing that we don't actually need to grow rural residential? And I guess, I come back to signalling as well, and we did talk about choice, and we saw a lot of people are saying they would choose to have a standalone over intensification, but we're actually going, we believe we need to intensify and people will have to make some choices, and some of them might be slightly harder choices. And so could the people who want rural residential also be required to have some slightly harder choices? I'm not taking it away from them, but I'm going, what's our current stock and availability? Do we really need to be offering more?
So through the Mayor, I don't have that split to hand. I can try and look back at our housing and business assessment and see if I can get that for you, but I can't do that right now. But one thing that did just come to mind is the housing preferences survey was income constrained. So it first of all asked people where they would like to live, and then when it factored in the price of the house and their income, it told them where they could live. And there was a large proportion of people who couldn't afford to live in our urban areas because they couldn't afford the housing. And so they were pushed into rural Tasman, which is where a lot of our rural residential housing is, which is unserviced, because we can't service obviously the whole region. So there is quite a proportion of people who cannot afford to live in our urban areas and therefore can only afford the lifestyle blocks, or not the lifestyle blocks, but the rural housing in the unserviced areas. So
yeah, I think my final comment is so I'm not taking away rural housing, I'm taking away lifestyle blocks. Well, I'm not taking them away, sorry, I'll correct that. So so my question is, because lifestyle blocks are typically not an affordable housing option, whereas rural living might be considered that. So again, it might require looking at the HBA, but do we actually need more rural residential?
Right, I'm going
And what's our
to go to
capacity?
Curtin. He's got his hand up, so hopefully you've got your hand up for this discussion, Curtin.
Yeah, so certainly take direction, but I wondered if it's useful to have some discussion of the population growth forecasts and the HVA, or whether that's relevant for, you know, the extent to which the rural residential is a touch point. But happy to take that later if that's.
Well, if you think it's, I'm just looking at my list of what we're going to cover off, and I can't see that in my list. Where, Jackie, is it on there?
It's number 4, actually, growth
Oh, it's next
projections.
up. Oh,
Yeah, so it's
okay,
next,
that's fine.
yeah. There's overlap, yeah.
Right, okay, so well, we're getting to that conversation, I think. So let me just get, I've just got a couple of other hands up in the chamber. So Curtin, I'll just go to Councillor Mailing, and then I might come back to you. Anyone else has got any commentary? Councillor Mailing.
Well, I look at these figures, and rural residential 4% with a slight increase 5%. So it's a small amount when you compare it with intensification and infill, which comes to 48%. The other thing, and I took Inga up there, up Pigeon Valley, where there was no issues with the environment. And that's a good example of where we've got lifestyle blocks that are going to end up rural residential. So rural residential is much smaller than a lifestyle block. Lifestyle blocks are 24 acres down to 6,000 square metres roughly, where you can run a couple of cattle beasts, a few sheep, whatever you do, or a pony. So rural residential is actually a lot smaller than a lifestyle block. So I think that's something to bear in mind. The other thing is, and we look at the area behind Mahana, the old forestry areas, where we're not providing any infrastructure at all, and they are rural residential as well. So they have a couple of big water tanks, they collect their water from the roof, and they run a fancy septic tank wastewater system that costs them a lot of money. It's not cheap housing, but it's a different lifestyle, and it does free up housing in other areas. So, and it's not valuable land. This old forestry land, it's clay. You have to import your blinking topsoil because it's just lumps of clay where they've removed the stumps. Not ideal to me, but people want to live in these areas. They get a nice view out towards D'Urville Island, and they're all on the tops of ridges. So I see it meets a need. It's only 4 to 5%, and it actually intensifies some of our lifestyle blocks, particularly if I look at Pigeon Valley, which was a good example that I used on Friday. So that's
Thank you. Some reflections, right? I think what I'm hearing is I think we do need to think about the population issues instead of looking at our projections and what that looks like as part of this conversation. It's a little bit unscripted at the moment, and I'll try and draw us into making some progress through in our on what we're going to have to decide about. One of the observations I would make listening to the questions and answers is that there is a real question here around affordability and a lack of affordable housing in our urban environment, and that is creating some outcomes. We need to really acknowledge that, and that comes back to my earlier points before around the role of kāinga ora and the issue about actually what type of housing do we need when it comes to affordability. And I think we've made some observations in the officer's report around that and some recommendations. So if the fact that you can't find an affordable home in the urban area probably is the issue that needs to be resolved, I would say, and it's the primary issue, as opposed to saying, well, therefore the default is that we start people have to move to other places because they can't afford housing where they want to live. But Curtin, let's just try and put the growth projections across this as well, and I guess the consideration is how significant rural residential as an option is going to be, given what we've got in terms of our projections.
Sure, thank you. So, you know, some of the submissions raised questions about the population projections. When councils come to the future development strategy, council staff are sort of put in an awkward position in some ways. Statistics New Zealand only produce sub-regional, i.e. for councils and regions, every 4 years. So there's a question about what to do. Do you get consultants in to produce population forecasts? Do you use the sort of out-of-date population projections? Or do you kind of create your own population forecasts? And I think quite reasonably. Nelson and Tasman have put together their own population forecast, plus getting in some expert advice. When I take a look at what those population forecasts look like, after 30 years, they're actually very close to what Statistics New Zealand's kind of high scenario might suggest. So they're kind of ballpark for what a more in-depth kind of process might get you to. Some submissions raise the issue that maybe there are improvements that can be done on the modelling side. I think that suggestion is true, but what it would give you is a richer suite of demographics that I don't see as being material here. You're kind of close to what Statistics New Zealand suggests for population growth, and kind of the aging kind of profile that you have makes sense. If Tasman and Nelson were to kind of opt for a weaker population growth forecast, then I think you really do run the risk of population actually racing the population forecast that you have in here, and that would come up with, you'd be realizing or forced to kind of realize how to home more people than you might have otherwise expected. In some ways, that's not just my view, but there was a MFE and HUD did look at the sort of HBA for councils across New Zealand, and they suggested that for Nelson and Tasman, that product was sound and reasonable, and they didn't particularly have any issues with the population forecasts that are there. So that matters when we start to kind of talk about the types of kind of impacts and what's kind of possible. But you should have faith in the soundness and reasonableness of the population projections that council staff helped prepare.
Thank you. Thank you, Curtin. Any questions for Curtin around the population projections? No, we seem to be reasonably settled on that issue at this point in time. Councillor Ogilvie.
Aren't we forced to have that figure? I mean, I know it's the high growth figure, but in terms of where Jackie and Kat and Chris are coming from, it's almost not in dispute.
I don't think we've got an evidential basis to change it. I think would be where I get to, and we should be relying on, we're testing the evidence. It's been very well set out in terms of the reports that we've got, and this is the opportunity really just to test it. So if there's anything you want to test in terms of that evidence, then we ask those questions. What I'm hearing from the panel is that no, you've read the material and you feel it's sound.
I think my only question is, we're talking about capacity, and we have to meet demand, and sometimes the demand is because of our climate and because of a number of factors. It's a very popular area to come to from all parts of New Zealand, and that has issues in terms of cost, impact, infrastructure, and even such things as if our wastewater from Bells Island is going out either onto the land or out to sea, increased growth, what impact is that having on land? What impact is that having on the marine environment? So if we have 26,000 more people, dwellings, then what's the impact of that on things like land and the sea, etc.? And we haven't really looked at those impacts as such. Now, it's probably outside the scope of the FDS, but it's something we might look at in terms of what growth is actually sustainable for the district.
All right, I'll pass that question.
It's a wide question.
It's a wide question. I'll pass that question to Chris.
So I think that relates to the carrying capacity issue that was raised by a few of the submitters, and really that's so there's two things to consider in there. The first is that sort of working out an ultimate carrying capacity is pretty complex. It's a very much a moving target and has been tried in other areas and doesn't really work, to be honest. The other issue is that when we were scoring the sites, the multi-criteria analysis does take things like the effect on bodies of water and biodiversity, and those sorts of things are considered within the multi-criteria analysis. So that in choosing the sites and recommending sites to you, that work has been done at a relatively high level, not right down at the very, very detailed level that you'd get at a plan change process, but still has been very much considered in the MCA.
Thank you. Councillor Ogilvie.
We had a high proportion who disagree with greenfield development, with 69%, one of the questions. And I think, and this is just my own interpretation, that was because they saw in Richmond West in particular a lot of highly productive land being lost to housing. And once it's in housing, it's lost forever. Almost to the extent we're sort of sitting on the branch, we're cutting off. And there's a lot of, where is food production going to come from if we lose all that food producing land? So I think that's part of the issue as well. And in terms of sustainability, how much more land can we lose with greenfield development, which is taking production out of our lifestyle?
Well, we have got a topic around highly productive land, and certainly in terms of the multi-criteria analysis that was considered. Jackie, have we got that? Whereabouts is that on our list today?
That is 12. Suggested as number 12, so it would be tomorrow.
Right. So we'll come and have that discussion. And I did ask for some questions about this particular topic, Councillor Ogilvie, and Jackie's provided some supplementary material, so we'll cover that off at that point, I think.
Yeah, my only caveat to that would be actually that Mirka, who is online today, can't be online tomorrow. She's giving evidence. So if you do want some specific feedback on productive land, you might want to ask Mirka while she's here. But I might just add that this FDS has tried to avoid highly productive land through the multi-criteria assessment. We do have some sites in the draft FDS that are highly productive that were in the last FDS and therefore are now being proposed for rezoning. But otherwise, highly productive land was seen as a no-go constraint, and the site was taken out at the first sieve, as it were.
All right. Well, we may go to Mirka in a moment. I'll just try and finish this section if I can, and if we've got time before lunch, we might actually cover off that topic. Any other questions on the growth projections? No. On the rural residential, just in terms of our overarching, well, I guess I've got a question is, if we were to go and look at the profile of our rural residential sections, where do they sit in the affordability continuum?
I mean, through the mayor, we'd need to probably do a bit of work on that. But I guess, again, going back to the housing preferences survey, that indicated that the rural sections are cheaper because when people's income and house prices were factored in, that's where a number of people could only afford houses in those locations. But we'd need to get some data for you if you...
Yes, and I guess just following up from Councillor Egger, just testing whether rural versus rural residential are the same things. I think what Councillor Mailing's described before are probably not properties that I would consider that an average person, if there is such a person, would consider to be in the affordable properties. We'll go to Councillor Egger and then I'll go to Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess, that was the point I wanted to make is, because we had, so like on some of the new sites that were proposed, or at least one, there was the residential zoning within a rural environment versus the rural residential zone. And the rural residential zone are the large lifestyle blocks. So, if you're considering them differently, then please clarify. But from the analysis and the table on page 195, to me, they do seem to be quite different. And so, for me, having residential zoned land in a rural area, good. Rural residential, I need to understand more why we need more of that. What's our current availability or capacity? Do we need to grow that when we have existing rural residential? We know that there is often a stage where they will become sections where people maybe find them too hard to manage because of age or other factors in their life, and so then shift down. So it feels like there is a revolving stock of rural residential versus the rural residentially zoned land within a rural environment, however you want to, yeah. They're very different things. And so, yeah, I need to have information on the rural residential zone.
Jackie?
Through the modus in response to that, and Cam can probably just clarify the lot sizes that we assumed in the FDS, where we've said unserviced rural residential, do range from 2,500 square metres to over a hectare. So there has been a range of section sizes. And I think from memory, it's varied according to town. So, for example, say Murchison or Golden Bay would generally have even larger sections than the more urban towns. So I'd have to double check what lot size we've allocated to each rural area, but there's certainly a range in sizes.
All right, thank you. Kim, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, just that Jackie was correct in her summation of that approach.
2,000 through to a hectare. And I guess this is one thing where, as we're going through this process, as we get to the specific locations, this is not a one size fits all exercise. So we've got to be mindful of that as we start to think about Synarnid, Takaka versus Central Nelson, where it isn't one size fits all. Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, thanks, sorry, Madam Chair. It was just a response to a question, sort of picking up a theme from Councillor Edgar, but your response to about rural living. And I'm just wondering, how's that broken down? Is that sort of population living in sort of the existing rural settlements, like, you know, the Tapaweras, the Murchison, the Collingwoods and so forth, which are basically people living in an established settlement in a rural area, I guess. And then you've got the rural residential. But I've got in my mind sort of those who are forced into living in rural areas. I'm thinking sort of redundant housing, you know, cottages and holiday accommodation and whatever else out there that are basically forced out there because of the cost of living in a rural area. So you have a sort of just trying to understand what you mean by rural living and how's that broken down and the composition of it, and whether the FDS will facilitate sort of alleviating some of those sort of less desirable outcomes.
So just through the mayor's, a couple of points there, I suppose. I mean, first of all, places like Murchison, we've learned through consultation, there's two markets in Murchison. There's a market for the town centre housing and there's a market for living in the valleys. And people go there for both. And there's probably more people that look for living in the valleys than in the town, actually. But because of the price of housing, there's a shortage of accommodation for teachers, for, you know, sort of tradies, all kind of normal jobs that people can no longer afford a house in Murchison. So they are now starting to look at smaller, more affordable houses in town as well. So that's why in the FDS in Murchison we have the two options there, rural residential and the housing in town too. When I talked earlier about the housing preferences survey and the proportion of people that couldn't afford housing in the urban areas and were pushed out to the rural, I haven't got those percentages to hand, but I can have a look and certainly report those back later.
Yeah, because I think there's sort of some wider considerations, those who are forced out there because they can't afford it. But, you know, this assumption, and it is an assumption, is that they're distant from employment, they're distant from things like education and just basic services like, you know, supermarket or food, and just services, you know, going to the doctor or whatever. So you're actually sort of imposing sort of those greater impositions of cost on those who can least afford it, and perpetuating this sort of rural residential. I'm not sure that's the direction I find particularly comfortable with.
Well, we'll get to that's a deliberations debate, isn't it? So we'll as we go through and we listen to all of the information that we've got and look at the evidence basis, and then we're going to get through down to some of the debate about what's in and out, and we'll have to really make sure that we're carefully working through our reasons as we go through into that process. Chris, you'd like to add something to the...
Sorry, I just see that Curtin's got his hand up.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, just feel the conversation's kind of moved on beyond my expertise or what I can offer the group this morning. When we move on to sort of rural residential, that's beyond what I can kind of offer the group. So I think I'll take leave if I may, Chair. And if there are questions.
I think that's absolutely fine, Curtin. I'll just check to make sure. Has anyone got any follow-up questions for Curtin today? We think we've covered off your topics quite clearly. You've turned your mind to I guess the question I have you've clearly turned your mind to some opposing expert views that have been expressed through submissions. Do you feel you've got sufficient to have considered those views? Do you feel you got sufficient material to have done that in terms of those opinions?
I think those conversations have been very useful, and they give you pause to think about a range of different views. But also, I think council should be, both councils should be pleased with the quality of the council staff in terms of the product that's been produced. There's a lot of effort that's gone on there, and you've got a robust and reasonable draft FDS. Notwithstanding the fact that you'll reach your own views about what needs to be in there, but it's a quality product. So my bit of a hat tip to the council staff.
Thank you, Curtin. We really appreciate your contribution. Thank you. Right. So we're rural residential. If we got any, Chris, you were going to respond, weren't you? Oh no, you weren't. That's right. You were just directing me to the Zoom. Any further follow-ups on residential at this point? I suspect we'll come back to it as we start to discuss specific sites.
I could make a comment too.
Deputy Mayor Brian.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mayor. Just in relation to the rural residential, it does cover a broad range as one of the issues. We have, as Jackie alluded to, in Murchison, where people use it for a bigger than a section. Quite often they do a trade or something like that and have some extra land for their equipment or items they might need to carry out their business. But one of the problems now is the availability of any sort of cheaper properties is pretty much gone. They're all, the accommodation demand in both Murchison and Tapua is so large that anything that even looks like it could be used for accommodation pretty much is being, whether it's on lifestyle blocks, rural residential, what I call rural residential in a rural areas like a small house or a medium-sized house on a block with a bit of additional land, half an acre to an acre. But then, of course, you've got rural residential on the fringe of Wakefield and the likes of Toach Review and Mapua, where it's what Jackie talked about, the 2,000 to 5,000 square metre sections, which in some ways are quite inefficient use of land, but have to be for the wastewater systems on those lots. So it's really complex situation. I don't think there's any easy answer. And then, of course, we've even looked at it as a council where rural residential could be subdivided further, and how you would manage that and how many lots you would gain wouldn't be a huge amount for the effort involved, but some people are looking to do that. Thank
you. And I think that just again, it emphasises that we're going to have to go site by site through this discussion, because it isn't one size fits all, and there are a number of factors in play. The infrastructure servicing is one we need to keep in mind as well. So these are, that's a factor that we have to think about as we go through the process. All right, nothing further on this. Oh, Councillor Rika.
Yeah, so just reiterating, if I can get or if we can all get the current capacity and availability information from the HBA, probably for Thursday when we're discussing, or Wednesday when we're discussing site specifics. And I had also just sent through a request about there's a graph at 7.12 our report about the resource consents, or the building consent data. And I was just interested in maybe a few years further back and just at what point Richmond West hit the market, just to see if that was possibly a key, because I didn't, anecdotally, I didn't think there was always such a, Nelson being half a Tasman. I didn't think that had always been the case. Certainly it is according to the 3 years provided here. So that's why I was interested in, just some data from a bit further back. And then, just at what point Richmond West came online, to see if that was maybe a key part of that impact.
Right, we should have those numbers, I would think, so because we have to report them to the Ministry for the Environment from memory. So we should have you might have already have them.
Yeah, we do. We can pull those out. I'm not quite sure for how many more years back, but we can certainly have a look and see what we can pull out.
Yeah, maybe 2015 or something like that. When did Richmond West sort of go?
2018. Plan change was 2017, I think, with the.
Okay, so maybe 2015.
We'll see what we've got, what we can get within that time frame.
Okay, we'll see what we've got there, because what we'll see is some quite large subdivisions coming through in Nelson as well during that period. But from memory, the numbers in Tasman have been ahead for quite some time. But my memory can be a bit faulty from time to time. Right, next topic, Muka. Yes. Kia ora, Muka.
Hello.
How are you? Thank you for your patience. And we thought now might be a good time to do highly productive land discussion.
Okay, fire away.
All right, so who had the highly productive land question? Councillor Ogilvie, I think it was. You were raising a discussion around the use of highly productive land.
Yes, and what sort of controls are within the FDS in terms of not, how can I express it, not extending the area of land highly productive. And my comment was, I think a lot of people who voted against greenfield development did so because they'd seen the loss of so much highly productive land in the last 4 or 5 years. They were quite happy for greenfield developments in, say, towns like Wakefield, Motueka, Mapua, Brightwater, but were very concerned and disagreed with development of greenfields in the Waimea Plains, where they saw were the highly productive soils, and that's sort of the food box of the district in lots of ways.
I'm not.
So, what is the question?
Was there a question here? David?
Are there any controls in that, or any controls you can suggest to limit that? I mean, zoning is the obvious control, but it's that concern in the population about our loss of control of developing productive land.
All right, so maybe it's what are our current controls in relation to protecting highly productive land? And Muka, if you're wanting to just probably to get the conversation going a little bit, because this is going to be a conversation, I suspect, is I had sent through some questions that I think you may have answered in for supplementary information, which was how far away is the NPS on highly productive land? Has MFE given any guidance on its likely content? How did Tasman and Nelson compare to other councils' highly productive land classifications? Are we more restrictive or less restrictive? To kind of get a context of how is highly productive land being treated in our region, and what might the future look like? And it may be that we can't take into account the future at this point, but you may have some guidance for us.
Yeah, so in terms of the NPS for highly productive land, we're hoping something will come out of the ministry possibly in August. We were told it was going to be April, but April has been and gone. So next thing they said was August. I have seen the content of it, but I have signed a confidentiality clause, so I can't talk about what's in there. We just have to wait and see. In terms of what other councils are doing, we had actually, my colleague Anne Wecking had sent an email around to all other councils to see how they classify highly productive land and what classification system they're using. And pretty much most councils, every council is doing something different. We are one of the only council that's got the productive land classification that we developed in 1994 and are currently refining. For the purpose of the FDS, I have mainly gone along with the LUC classification system, because the LUC classification system is what has been talked about in the NPS HPL, and it's what's used consistently across other councils. So pretty much all other councils use LUC, but some have refined the LUC layer for their region, or some have used the national scale mapping, and some, like us, have got another productive land classification system on top of it. So for the FDS, I've used the LUC classification system, but I have also then always double checked our PLC system as well to make sure that if the LUC said it wasn't highly productive, but our PLC said that we think it's highly productive, I still scored it as highly productive. So when I had a look at the sites, I looked at the percentage of highly productive land, either LUC 1, 2, or 3 within that site. If it was a significant loss of highly productive land, I scored it a 0. So a 0 means it was out. If it was partial loss of 1 or 2, LUC 1 or 2, or some loss of LUC 3, it scored a 1. So it was still a very low score, a very low multiplying factor. Whereas sites that there was no loss of LUC 1 to 3 land would get a 4. So that is now a reduction in highly productive land. So that's how we scored it. In terms of controls, I think the controls come from the policy makers, not from myself. My only control is scoring the sites according to, is it highly productive or not, and what scoring would it get? Therefore, is it in or out, or what weighting has it got? After that, from what I understand, there's another 22 attributes, and it's a community decision. All I can add is, I think this is highly productive. This would be a significant loss of highly productive land. Therefore, it's a score 0 or a score 1.
Okay, Mirka, thank you very much. So that's quite clear in the way that the multi-criteria analysis was developed for the evidence base of what goes in. I'll just go to Councillor McGurk and then I'll come to Jackie.
Thanks. Thanks, Rich. Just a point of clarity here. Yeah. How do you define significant and partial? So is there a number?
Yeah. Yeah, that was quite hard. There is no number. There was no number. So when I looked at the parcel site, so significant to me is most of the site. Whereas partial loss, I'm just trying to think of a couple of the sites I looked at where they were on a hill. The hill is not highly productive, but the slither between the bottom of the hill and the highway, for example, was flat, and therefore, according to, it's highly productive. So that's a partial loss of highly productive because it's part of the overall site. But I wasn't given a percentage of, if it's 80%, it's significant. If it's less than 80, it's not significant. Yeah, quite often, to be honest, it was, say, for example, a site would have been 60% highly productive, but the 40% was still productive. So therefore, It is a significant loss of highly productive land.
So just for helpful, did you look at the you looked at the lots, did you consider the neighbouring or adjacent blocks as part of that assessment?
Yeah, I did. And I looked at some of the physical constraints of that. I'm just trying to recall, there was a site, I think it's in Brightwater. It's classed as LUC1, highly productive, but it's wedged between a river, a highway, and a township. So although it is highly productive, it probably can't be used highly productive because of sensitivity effects. So I think instead of scoring that a 0, I scored it a 1, keeping in mind those physical constraints around it.
Right. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Come across to Councillor Edgar.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. So just clarifying that in using the land use classification, that picks up land that is unused but productive versus, that it picks up land that is unused currently in productive manner, but is still actually, the land use classification is still productive, because that was something raised in submissions.
Yeah, so we don't, if something is classified as being highly productive, what it looks at is the attributes that make a parcel of land versatile. So the more versatile something is to grow a variety of different crops, the more productive it is. Whether it is used productively currently or not doesn't make it productive or unproductive. It's got the physical characteristics to be productive for a variety of crops, because land use may change over time. And just because the current landowner doesn't want to use it productively, doesn't mean that we should therefore put it into housing and can't use it in future. Yeah.
Excellent. No, great. The other question I sent through, and I'm sorry, I just can't find it because I did send through a few questions. Thank you. It was just around, there was a submission from about quarry productivity for quarrying purposes. I think I'm summarising that roughly accurately. And the submitter made the comment that gravel is needed to help with the with housing, and so therefore that land should be classified as highly productive. Right, I think I'm roughly summarising my that submission.
Mika, I'm not sure if you have responsibility for quarries.
Well, it's just whether it's classified as highly productive land or...
I think it's dealt with differently, but that's right. Mika, you could respond. I'm sure you probably know how it's dealt with.
It's a bit of a can of worm, that question. So you know, a land is, like I said before, it is classed as highly productive on its merits, on the physical attributes and limitations of the soil layers, as well as the climate conditions, the slope, and so on. Gravel extraction is not classed as one of the versatile uses of a land that makes it more productive. The problem comes from when we classify a parcel of land as highly productive and we have an application for somebody to take gravel. It probably works, you know, if that person was saying classifying a piece of land as highly productive, so it includes gravel, it should be used for gravel, it probably works opposite to in their favor, because if there's a piece of land that is classified as highly productive and they want to take gravel, it's probably very hard to get a resource consent to do that, because it's digging up and it's changing the layers of the soil, which will change the drainage characteristics of the land to be used again for productivity, you know, for productive use in the future. It's a very big can of worms.
Thank you. Yes, and I have now found that question and the answer. So between what you've just provided then and the answer that's in the attachments, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Okay, go to Councillor Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mirka, my question just relates to the productive land again. Just in relation to the blocks you looked at, did you take into consideration any minimum area or productive sort of capability that would be economic? And secondly, did you give consideration to whether the blocks had potential to be irrigated?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that question, to be honest, I grapple with a lot with individual resource consent application. What makes the size of a parcel of land productive or not? So I have taken it into consideration where there was a lot of fragmentation. So where there was just the same example for before, where there's a slither of land that's wedged between a township and a highway and a river. Yes, it's big enough because it's LUC1, it suits itself for market gardening. Therefore, a small parcel of land could be used productively and economically, but from a practical point of view, it probably won't be because there's sensitivity effects. Depending on the classification, the land sizes would differ. So we have to be very careful here, because all I can keep in mind at the moment is what is currently economic. So LUC1, for example, something that's highly productive, is versatile enough to be used for market gardening. Market gardening doesn't need a lot of hectares to make it an economic productive parcel. Whereas if it's LUC 3 or 4, which is intensive pastoral production, you probably need quite a few more hectares to make it an economic unit. Yeah, so it depends on the classification. The lower it is classified, the larger the land parcels, pretty much. But sadly, there isn't a definition. I wish there would be one.
Good luck.
Yeah, and I can't predict what the future land uses are going to be and what's going to be economic or not. So
no, exactly.
Thank you, Mirka. Any further questions? All right, so we know that this is part of our assessment criteria that Mirka's explained to us how she's applied that. And as we get into looking at the different sites, we may have some specific questions around that. But Mirka, I think we understand the technical input into this work. So thank you very much for answering questions for us today and explaining a bit more about the work that you do. And all the best with the contribution you're making to the future space and highly productive land.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got half an hour before we break. What would you like to do, Jackie? MCA, would you like to get that?
Can I just clarify one thing just in relation to the highly productive land and the MCA? So if it's scored a 0 or a 1, so if it was a lot of highly productive land or partly highly productive, then it was ruled out as a no-go constraint, just to make that clear. The only sites that were added back in were 2 employment sites, one in Brightwater and one in Wakefield, because we felt there was probably a need for more employment land there. And the other sites that originated in the 2019 FDS that were reassessed and are currently being proposed for rezoning. But otherwise, highly productive sites were ruled out.
Ruled out. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Now, in terms of helping us with our deliberations, do you think the next logical thing to do is to actually go to the multi-criteria analysis framework, or would you like to go to building height? What would be the most useful thing? Or is there something that we could deal with quite quickly?
Probably MCA might be a bit quicker, do you think? Yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, let's have a go at that one. So we'll let you introduce that topic.
Okay, so
that's topic 12.
Yeah, can do. Yeah.
So we've already discussed one factor.
Cam, feel free to chip in. We're going to talk about the multi-criteria analysis. So in relation to the submissions on this, a lot of them were actually quite specific, and the report deals with them at pages 24 onwards. We've tried to draw out some of the specific issues that were raised, such as the MCA being questionable, that when unweighted and weighted site scores were compared, there was little difference. That very few of the criteria affected the National Policy Statement on Urban Development's objectives. You can see them all listed there. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, some submitters found that the MCA was very sound, and Waka Kotahi agreed that the MCA does emphasise the importance of accessibility by public and active transport. So as we talked a little bit already this morning, we had approximately 22 different assessment criteria that we assessed each site against. And we also assessed every new site that was proposed through submissions against exactly the same criteria, and the same staff were involved as well. And it was obviously quite time intensive, involving a lot of experts in that exercise. Now, I probably won't go through each sort of submission point that was raised in detail, but we have responded to some of those criticisms that were raised in pages 27 and 28 of the officer's report. I mean, we disagree that the weightings have made little difference. What the MCA process has shown is that the weighting that was applied to accessibility, for example, and to servicing of sites has indicated that the intensification sites rank a lot higher than some of our greenfield sites. Yeah, we had specific criticisms about the weighting that was used, and that the criteria didn't reflect the NPSUD, but what we have to remember is that the criteria were developed from a broader range of objectives from a number of national policy statements, not solely the national policy statements on urban development. I think it's probably fair to say that the report provides enough analysis of the points that were raised. We did have a submitter who felt that 3 highly productive areas had been ranked as the highest for development, but in fact that's not the case. As I mentioned before, it was a no-go constraint if they scored 0 or 1. So 2 of those 3 sites were actually knocked out immediately. The one site that did go through T115 was because it's currently zoned for developments already down in Low Queen Street and has development proposals for that land and is surrounded by commercial and residential development already. So that's a bit of a sort of some broad context. Cam, did you want to add anything else about the MCA?
Just from our approach with the project team, and this came back to the issue of how much can we reasonably get out of intensification. I think ideally the MCA was probably, it was not the sole factor in determining whether a site was in or out. It was to provide an indication. If we had significantly more capacity from the sites we assessed, it would have played a much bigger role, I think it's fair to say, but we lost a lot of potential capacity through those no-go constraints. So significant natural hazards, highly productive land. So in all the sites we assessed, there was about 30,000 potential homes that were just a straight no-go constraint. So we started to get quite tight in terms of the overall number of options that we could consider for achieving that 24,000. So this really provided a way to kind of look at the sites, especially at the margin, in terms of what was kind of more appropriate. And in terms of that weighting issue, providing more weighting around that accessibility criteria, to do that would essentially kind of invalidate the rest of the criteria because it would just essentially be the only determining factor. So it was an important need to kind of not set any kind of weighting particularly high to essentially nullify the rest of the MCA analysis. So we did look at the impact of if we gave that a much higher weighting, and essentially we found it just kind of distorted the picture and didn't give a fully accurate representation of how sites performed against a much broader number of criteria.
Anything further to add? It's quite a broad topic. No, looking at the screen. Is there anyone? There's no one on the screen at the moment who's going to be offering officer advice on these subjects, is there? No, that's right. Just wanted to check that. Councillor Rico.
Thank you. So I guess my key question around the use of the multi-criteria analysis, and I'll use an example that is one of the site-specific suggestions, and that's T219, which is at 20.30 in the report. And essentially, and I think this has been used on other occasions as well, but it's sort of like the site itself didn't seem to score well, but then it was amalgamated with another site that then changed the overall scoring. So I guess I just have a concern about that approach because, Yeah, I guess I need explanation on the use of the MCA in that type of approach.
Yeah, so looking at that example you've given there, they weren't amalgamated. Site T219 is adjacent to site T181, and they were assessed separately. What the report says is that one didn't score as well as the other, even though they were next door, because there was different factors at play, including terrestrial ecology, biodiversity, and the impact on life-sustaining quality of natural resources. So we were clarifying why there was quite a different ranking of those two sites, even though they're adjacent.
No, that wasn't my question. I thought 20.30 mentioned, but the two sites together could be included in the FDS with the actual boundary of the site to be determined at the rezoning stage. I thought you'd done another assessment, essentially, of the two sites together, but no, not correct?
No.
Oh, okay, right, thank you. I thought that the MCA analysis had changed if you put the two together. That's what I was wanting to check based on my interpretation of what you'd said there. Okay, great. Good clarification.
Right, any other questions on the MCA? All right, so there's, just let me go to my notes. I've got just to come back. I've got to go back up the page. Pardon me. Could you just give me the page reference again, Jackie? I've just scrolled off it.
Page reference for
the MCA. That's right, 238. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's right, back up here. This is the topic. We had several submissions that were concerned that the MCA hadn't included carbon emissions from buildings, the building of dwellings and business units. And your commentary is essentially that the FDS is a high level strategy. And I've seen this reflected as we also get to the greenhouse gas emissions discussion around using vehicle kilometres travelled, and whether there is a methodology for actually considering the full emissions profile from a development. And I'm just wanting to just tease that out a little bit to say, have we missed anything in an opportunity here to go? Given we've made some assumptions, right? So we've gone through and said, right, in our G, what were they? Our G1s to 7s, we've made some assumptions about topography, about housing topography, right? So we should be able to make some assumptions somehow about actually the issue of greenhouse gas emissions from construction. So I'm just wondering how we address that broader understanding of, it's a crossover between the greenhouse gas emissions one and the MCA essentially.
It's quite an interesting point in a very live discussion with the kind of emissions reduction plan coming out. There's some slightly counterintuitive things as well. So essentially the lowest kind of emission form of development is essentially a timber detached home. More intensive forms of housing use concrete and steel and stuff, so they actually have higher embodied carbon. So there's actually a trade-off where, while on the one sense we're trying to encourage intensification, but the actual construction of that might actually have a greater emissions profile. The trade-off is in kind of like long-term transport issues. So it's not necessarily an easy, oh, well, all the greenfield areas will have a higher emissions profile from building, because they actually might not. So it's probably not necessarily cut and dry. We've recently discussed this issue with Kāinga Ora with their sustainability team. But the general discussions we've had with both Waka Kotahi and Kāinga Ora is vehicle kilometres travelled is a very good proxy to use, especially because a lot of energy and stuff like that in New Zealand is generated by renewable sources as well. So we're a bit different than other countries which rely more heavily on gas and coal for electricity generation, where you get those benefits from intensification, like better insulation in apartment buildings and stuff. So we're slightly different in the New Zealand context. So we think vehicle kilometres travelled is a reasonable proxy in the absence of more advice from central government.
Thank you, Cam. It's very helpful. Councillor Rika.
I did have a question about the VKT analysis that was provided. Do you want that now or later?
Drew's here, so I think we could do that because it's going to come across to the greenhouse gas emissions reduction topic 5. So I'm happy to take those if Drew is there. Kia ora, Drew.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. Afternoon now. Afternoon. It's moved on. A question from Councillor Rika.
Yeah, just a question on the VKT analysis that you undertook, and thank you for that work. I was just wondering when if you looked at the public transport changes and the increased investment in active transport, as well as increased use of electric vehicles when then calculating the greenhouse gas emissions. So probably first the public transport changes and active transport when looking at actual VKT, and then also then the secondary part of my question is the increased use of e-vehicles in calculating the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, so through the chair, there's just a couple of things. I'm just actually working on a slight update to that memo that I made that I'd love to be able to bring tomorrow when I've just finalised it. It just takes into account the changes in settlement patterns that have been brought forward by staff.
All right.
But I'm happy to answer those questions right now to cover that off, because that doesn't change. My update doesn't change the answer to those questions.
All right, that's fine. As long as we're not distracting you from getting that other piece of work finished. That's my only concern.
So through the chair, so the short answer is yes, we took all of what you've just talked about on board. The VKT analysis doesn't specifically take walk and cycling public transport into account. It just looks at all vehicle kilometres travelled. So it doesn't matter if it's by a bus or by a vehicle. It's the distance travelled that someone needs to take. The greenhouse gas emissions does take into account whether it is by bus, whether it is by electric car or an ICE internal combustion engine. So it does take all those things into account. We have used initially, and this is why I'm updating it, we did initially use Ministry of Transport guidelines on what the uptake of electric vehicles is going to be over time. We've also used their guidelines on what the uptake of public transport is going to be over time, and also taken into account what we've predicted in our regional public transport plan. But more recently, the Ministry for the Environment brought out the emissions reduction plan, and that has slightly different numbers, and hence this is why I'm tweaking my my work a little bit, my model a little bit, to take that into account.
Thank you so very much. Like, really, thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Look, we really appreciate the work you're putting into this, because it is quite an important factor for us, and very important factor for us when we're going to go into the site selection process. So we'll let you get on and finish that piece of work, and look forward to seeing it when it's ready.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, hang on, just a second, Drew. Councillor Ogilvy's got a question.
Drew, when you come back to us, are you likely to give us some impact on, say, greenhouse gas emissions for rural residential sites, and how, I suppose, development of those rural residential areas, with people moving from those areas to towns like Wakefield, Mapua, Motueka, Richmond, or wherever, will impact on your calculations in terms of...
Yeah, so through the chair, sorry, if that was the end of the question, yeah, through the chair,
right.
Yes, I have taken into account the rural residential sites of Pigeon Valley, Mittens, and there was another one, Falcon. I think it was the Falcon Bridge. So I've taken those into account. However, as just a note of caution here, is that with all the settlement areas that are an existing town, we've got really good census data to be able to tell us what the travel patterns for those areas are. When you're getting into a rural area, the census data is somewhat spotty, because it takes a wider rural area into account. So I've had to make some assumptions when you get to those more rural areas. But generally speaking, A rural residential area will have a greater VKT and emissions because they won't have the public transport. They're less likely to be close enough to a town for people to walk and cycle. That's not always the case. With e-bikes now, you will get some portion that will cycle if there is good cycling infrastructure. So we'll try to take some of that into account with the modelling that we've done.
Thank you, Drew. That's all the questions for now, and we'll look forward to discussing this again tomorrow or Thursday. Jackie, would you like to, or Chris, would you like to pick one more topic that would take 10 minutes?
We're wondering about having an outcomes. Actually, that should be a fairly self-contained one, hopefully. This page 23, is it? Yeah.
Hang on, Jackie, can you just repeat that one? What you were going to do? We'll just have a...
And the FDS outcomes, page 23.
That would be great. Thank you. 23. Page 23. Yes.
Oh, is it 22?
22, actually, sorry.
Sorry, there's a... Yeah.
When you're ready.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, we've got 8 minutes. Fantastic. So one of the key things that was very clear with the outcomes and the response from the submitters, in particular to the outcomes, was there was a little bit of confusion about how to treat them, and there was a range of ways that people responded to them. So there was submitters that responded in the way that we expected, treating the outcomes as essentially an aspiration of this is where we want to be, or want to get to, if you like. There were some who disagreed with the submissions, with the outcome, but then in the text of their response, it was pretty clear that actually they supported the outcome, but they were responding on the basis of, is the outcome what we're achieving now, or does the FDS achieve that outcome in itself? So there was a range of responses along those lines. And we provided, there's an example of that provided in the table there in that section. I think there's not really, the process we've gone through in developing these outcomes has been pretty rigorous, I'd suggest anyway, that, it's been through multiple workshops and they have been developed in response to the various national policy statements and bits of legislation that we've considered in this process. So I'm not really sure there's too many options to go and make wholesale changes to them at this stage. The one change that we are recommending is, and it's in response to a suggestion from the Nelson Tasman 2050 submission, is that a clearer term to use would be objectives rather than outcomes. And in hindsight, that may have been a little clearer to people. At the same time, I don't think the confusion has gone and skewed the results that, as we've been able to go through and look at the written responses to each of them and determine whether or not people are supportive of them.
Thank you, Chris. Right, any questions, Chris? Clear on? No questions on that one? And I think you've, oh yes. Got to be quick, Councillor. Sorry, go.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to find a page. Okay, so a couple of questions. Firstly is page 142 of the attachments. Barker and Associates had two recommendations in regards to changes for the outcomes. Now, one has been picked up, which is the suggestion of changing outcomes to objectives, which I agree with. The second one says, add further description on the purpose, role of the outcomes/objectives, including that they are aspirational, and implementing the FDS will require balancing and trade-offs between outcomes/objectives. That just hasn't been picked up in the staff report at all. And I was just wondering for, firstly, comment on that, if we intended to pick up that second recommendation from Barker and Associates.
Yes, we do intend on incorporating that into the final FDS, and it was really just a case of it's a relatively minor amendment, but happy for it to be either noted.
I mean, I think any amendment still needs to be noted, I believe. So thank you.
But we might have to put a omnibus noting recommendation, I suspect.
Yeah,
we'll see how we go. We'll come back and review that in the next couple of days.
I mean, that's the only other one going forward. That's the only other one that hasn't been picked up. I don't have more coming up for future topics. The next one was, and I'm not sure if it was the outcome wording or just the questionnaire wording, because we had number 1 or 2, we mentioned land use transport, and I can't find the page now. It was about consolidating or something like that, and it said land use transport, but it actually turns out that the phrase should have been land use and transport, and sort of really quite changes the meaning, because we did have a few people going, what is land use transport? And is it, you know, how we work out all the different transportation uses versus land use and transport. So is there anything we need to do there other than add the word and yeah, is there any consideration of the submissions that we need to take into account based on that?
I think the addition of the and in the final document is sufficient to make the outcome correct, or objective, as we're going to call them, or suggesting we call them. With a lot of the, you know, we did have a few submissions where the people said they didn't understand it. Now, there was a reasonable percentage of those that said they didn't understand it and then followed up with some reasonably detailed commentary that demonstrated that we're pretty sure they did understand. If the language confused them, they were getting the intent of it. There still were people who that's all they wrote, but overall, I think people were grasping the concept, and a lot of that was because it's talked about in the rest of the FDS as well. It's not just the one place where we talk about integrating land use and transport.
Yeah, thank you. And then my final question is just, there was a lot of commentary around the phrase where people choose to live, or I think outcomes. I'm trying to find the question. But it was, yeah, it was one of the outcomes that did have a lot of comment, and it was just around that, you know, that choice element.
To help us with that one, Chris?
Yeah, sure. I'll pass it to Rachel.
So that outcome was essentially a simplified version of the policy directive in the NPSUD, and specifically policy 5, which is really directing enabling heights and densities relative to demand in a particular location, as well as providing policy 1, which talks about providing for a variety of housing types.
So does the wording in our outcome do you think sufficiently provide that, or demonstrate that intent?
I think it does in a more simple, user-friendly way. The wording in the MPSUD is actually very technical and I think quite difficult to understand. So this was really just about simplifying that.
Thank you.
Can I just add a little bit to that as well? As there didn't seem to be any confusion, if you like, over the use of it. Just to be clear on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, panel, would you like to have a go at doing some more in principles just before we finish? So if we were to go to page 8 of my agenda, it'll be maybe slightly different starting and then numbered. I'm at clause 3.11, 3.12, 3.13 and 3.14. Are you feeling ready to address these in an in principle manner? So this is essentially the population projection, the housing land capacity calculation uptake rate, the outcomes and the multi-criteria, which we're now calling objectives, and the multi-criteria analysis framework. You were feeling ready for those ones, or would you like to reflect on those overnight? As we get through, we're going to have to go as we go through and we come back to do our full deliberations. We'll make sure that we're capturing reasons, but if you would like to leave those and have longer to discuss them as we go through, that's fine. So Susan's got something to add. We had some others to add as well.
Yeah, so I was just going to note that I've got down a few things for the omnibus resolution that'll go at the end, which relate to some of these. And one of those was amend section 7.1 of the draft FDS to clarify that the rate of intensification assumed is not a target and that the councils will aim for a greater proportion of growth to be catered for in the urban areas. And the second one was amend the table in the implementation of the draft FDS to clarify that the quarterly monitoring and annual reporting will involve monitoring of the uptake rate of intensification. So they'll be picked up in the omnibus one, but we'll have to draft that up separately.
So Susan, on that basis, I think what we might do is, given I'm pushing you right past the end of the time here, as much as we could do these today, I think probably we do need to have the chance to capture those ones and speak to them as we go through. So for instance, well, I will accept your 15% uptake rate. I'll do it reluctantly, but I haven't got an evidence base at this point to move it out any further. But what we'll be starting to look at actually what we're going to be telling the councils to do, and with an expectation they'll get on and actually make sure that we start to see that moving a bit faster. So I guess I do want a bit of time to be able to just speak to those ones in terms of our thinking. So let's pause for today. We'll adjourn and come back again tomorrow. And I'll just
just in response to Susan's comment about some of the amendments, particularly the look at 3.1.3. Is it worth having an amendment to do the in principles as we work the way through, rather than sort of have a whole lot of omnibus ones at the end like this? There's only a couple of minor moderations. I think my preference would be to deal with those
as we go. Yes, I think we could. I think we could we'll capture those. So when we come back tomorrow, we'll get the ones we've got today, add them in, and then we can reorder them into some sort of logic if you need to. All right.
Helpful if there's an email goes out with what the
yes, and then we can look at them overnight. It'll be fantastic.
Not have to word circle or anything on the day.
Right. Thank you, panel, for your contribution. Thank you to everyone who is been supporting us on the screen, both members of the public watching in and media, and the staff who have provided information today. Thank you to all the staff and consultants in the room, and thank you to our support staff who we couldn't do anything without, so it wouldn't be a meeting without them. Yes, we'll close with karakia. I'm happy to close if you like. So we'll just close with karakia, and I'll close with kia tau today. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te tātou ariki, a ihu karaiti, ni tu arawa o tu atua, ni te whiwhi nā tahitanga, ki te wairua tapu, aki, āmene. Kia ora.